This fighter squadron is flying faster than the speed of sound. These pilots engaged in combat miles above the Earth. It was a truly fantastic concept. But when the first F-100 Super Sabres were delivered to the U.S. Air Force in 1953, that fantasy became a reality. Until then, the only planes to have broken the sound barrier were experimental test aircraft. With the arrival of the F-100, the age of supersonic air combat had truly begun. Their arrival wasn't an uneventful one. New planes set two records, the last subsonic world speed record and the first supersonic world speed record. After 4 years of development, the F-100 ushered in a new era. Ahead lay a long, tumultuous career that would be marked by distinction and marred by crashes and controversy. Overcoming the sound barrier was a landmark achievement, and the F-100 marked the dividing line between the first and second generation of jet fighters. Because the Air Force was just reaching the 100s to give as new plane designations, the first assortment of supersonic aircraft were known as the Sentry fighters. The Sentry fighters were renowned and included the F-105. But it was from the cockpits of the F-100 Super Sabres that the Thunderbird pilots would eventually choose to perform their aerobatic magic. The plane had its problems, including landing characteristics that were more like a controlled crash, but in flight, its responsiveness and reliability won the affection of the most critical of pilots. Though Super Sabre was the product of a very distinguished design team, the North American company had been quietly successful since its inception. There had been no upheaval in the company since 1935, and within this stable atmosphere, the designers were encouraged to probe the cutting edge of aviation development. The Super Sabre was born in 1949, when the designers began exerting efforts to take the next major step forward, breaking the sound barrier. By the time the F-100 was developed, North American prided itself on having built the greatest fighters of World War II and Korea. Opinions may differ, but the two aircraft in question, the Mustang and the Sabre, would certainly be contenders for the title. As the third fighter from the stable, the F-100 faced the challenge of living up to this legacy. The company's first fighter was a classic. The P-51 Mustang was truly a legend. It had firmly established the company's name in the world of combat aircraft construction. In the European and Pacific theaters, the Mustang made its mark as a superb escort and attack aircraft. The first flown in 1940, it stood at the end of a long line of propeller-driven fighters and was one of the greatest ever flown. But the P-51 remained in service after World War II, overlapping into the developmental age of early jets. It was still in service in large numbers during the Korean conflict and was a mainstay in the ground attack and support missions. North American built over 16,000 P-51s. This massive success with their first fighter project served the company well. It established them as a producer of the first-class fighters, chilled the company coffers, and set them up to make their next series of design studies. North American was ready to step into the jet age. It did so with two new planes, the FG-1 for the Navy and the F-86 for the Air Force. By far, the more successful of the two was the Air Force F-86, thus Sabre. By this time, the company was so confident that the F-86 was delayed for over a year, as the company designers sorted out the problems of giving the plane swept wings and a tail. North American stability and prosperity allowed for that kind of risk-taking. and the resulting aircraft richly repaid the company's investment and patience. Sabres went into mass production in 1949, arriving just in time for their baptism by fire in Korea. The F-86 first went into service in Korea in December 1950. By that time, the Air Force had to run into stiff opposition from MiG-15s, which were also clearly outperforming their American jets. In mortal struggles over the Korean landscape, the newly arrived Sabre established combat superiority over the Russian plane. Better training and tactics, along with technology, for what really carried the day. Meanwhile, the Sabre's designers were tackling a new challenge, the sound barrier. Work commenced in 1949 and progressed rapidly through 1950. Early experiments in extending the capability of the Sabre merely revealed the limitations of its design. The engineers quickly returned to a blank sheet of paper, and in the end, developed a totally new and much larger aircraft. In January 1951, the Air Force gave the nod to this new design. Soon after, the F-100 Supersonic Dayfighter was launched into production. No experimental or X-aircraft were ever built. In fact, the first F-100s would be a production prototype or Y-plane with typical North American confidence. This one from the drawing board to the construction bay 3 months prior to the Air Force approval. Aviation technology was leaping ahead at the time, and the F-100 was quickly outdated. But the jet was too useful for early retirement and complemented new designs throughout the coming year. The Century fighters were the core of the U.S. air power for many years. They represented an enormous commitment to advanced technology and immense capital investment. Their development was a construction and reflected revolutionary advances in aviation theory and practice. They became the testing ground for innovations in many fields: aerodynamics, materials, methods of machining and construction, engines, avionics, navigation, and fuels. All the changes were unlimited to technology. There was also a revolution in tactics and arms. Chief among these were developments in missiles and nuclear weapons. In time, the F-100 found its niche as a fighter bomber. At the outset, it was designed as an air superiority fighter, but soon gained multi-role capability. The wing was redesigned to carry up to 6,000 pounds of stores on 6 pylons. This enabled the Super Sabre to carry a many variety of weapons and ensured that the plane could pack a heavy punch. The Korean stalemate cemented American determination to be fully prepared for future conflicts, and the whole approach to weaponry was reapproached. Machine guns soon gave way to more powerful weapons. Some theorists predicted that the unguided bomb would soon be replaced by missiles. The idea spread, and a number of F-100Ds were altered to accommodate the bullpup tactical air-to-surface missile. This weapon of the future was guided by the pilot with the cockpit toggle. Like early versions of many things, it wasn't terribly effective. Experience would show that the unguided bomb held a considerable cost advantage over complex missiles. The new weapons also proved to be too expensive for widespread use. Still, the relative accuracy was considered essential in some combat situations. Early F-100 days had some major faults. In part, these were due to design changes, ordered after the initial contract had been signed during 1952. These changes included a critical shortening of the tail. This left plane with the very bad rule coupling problems, and after 6 major accidents, the F-100s were grounded. 2 pilots died when, through no fault of their own, their plane spun out of control and then broke up. In response to this tragedy, the tail was enlarged to its original shape and the wings extended. These changes were retrofitted to existing planes and incorporated into the new ones when production resumed. Apart from this very major flaw, the test series at Edwards Air Force Base went fairly smoothly. The only other concern focused on the plane's landing characteristics. This was eventually addressed through the pilot training rather than modifications to the plane. Experiments in zero-length launch were also conducted at Edwards. The F-100 had a range of well under 600 miles. It was later given in-flight refueling capability, either from a tanker or the buddy system from tanks on another plane. As a result, it became capable of extended patrols and long-range strikes. "203 F-100As were built, the first 70 being delivered before the roll coupling problems were corrected. Fixing this delayed the program, and it wasn't until the spring of 1955 that production resumed. By that time, the upgraded F-100C was undergoing tests. The B designation had already been committed to a version intended to fly faster than twice the speed of sound. Design problems were limited to the potentially fatal control losses experienced at high speeds. At low speeds, the plane could also be very unforgiving. Here, a pilot realized that he has undershot his landing point and frantically attempts to put his plane back up. In opening his throttle too fast, he included a compressor stall and then, in a series of overcorrections, fatally compounded his problem. This incident was not unique, and the term saber dance gained a new and darker meaning. The F-100 design was not necessarily flawed. The problem stemmed from the plane's purpose, which was to go fast, and many of the characteristics essential in going fast inhibit low speed control. The F-100 stalled at around 150 knots. It was sluggish and unresponsive anywhere near that lower speed. The pilot's forward view was seriously obstructed. The throttle of a slowed-down Sabre jet was touching, and landings were never simple. In the end, the F-100's low speed control problems were never fully corrected. It was just another deadly possibility that the pilots had to learn to live with. Training, experience, and the instinct for self-preservation kept the accident rate down. And most buyers found it safer to strain the undercarriage in high-speed landings than to meddle with the F-100 at low speeds. The Super Sabre embodied the demands of supersonic flight, from the sharp lips of its air intake to the sweep of its wings. Even stationary F-100s gave an impression of speed. There were many innovative touches about them. Fully pivoting slab horizontal tail surfaces were positioned as low as possible on the flattened belly of the fuselage. There were no outboard flaps. Instead, a system of leading-edge slats were employed. Throughout its career, the F-100 had the type of problems to be expected of such an advanced design. In some ways, it was an adventurous experiment. North Americans selflessly circulated information about these problems throughout the American aerospace industry. Though it was information obtained through costly research and analysis, the companies passed it on nevertheless. Because of this, the industry as a whole advanced, and mistakes were seldom repeated. North American and most Super Sabre pilots were well pleased with the plane. This included the famed Thunderbirds aerobatic team. This loyalty went very deep. Once, they were issued replacement F-105s, and finding these not up to par, promptly returning them to their Super Sabres. The Thunderbirds flew the F-100s from 1956 until 1969. They started with the first 6 examples of the C model and stayed with the F-100 from then on. Needless to say, they came to know every virtue and every vice that the aircraft had.
Okay, Thunderbirds, let's do a loop. Play the deck. Nose coming up. Okay, and with the pull. Right on in. Topping the loop now, ease it off. Let it float a little. All right, back in with the pull. Now let's ease it off and play the deck. Smoke off now.
The Thunderbirds also wrote another sad chapter of the F-100 story. After a crash, during one of their air shows, investigators turned up fatigue problems in the wings of the plane. It is suspected that some of the Super Sabres that went down in Vietnam may have lost due to the same flaw. This diagnosis led to immediate remedial action, saving other pilots from a similar fate. The Thunderbirds' performances with the Super Sabre are proof that even if practice cannot make perfect, it can come very, very close. These thrilling planes were not specifically built supermodels. They were stock aircraft maintained and flown for a specific purpose. The Thunderbirds exaggerate and embellish normal maneuvers in a choreographed sequence that appears to push the aircraft into unusual or extreme conditions. But each pilot is a pro, and the test is to match his ability with that of the plane. Because of the high accident rate, a 2-seat version, the F-100F, was developed to familiarize pilots with the plane. This effectively transferred the bulk of the accident rate onto the trainers. The F model suffered heavily. Over 1/4 of them were lost in non-combat mishaps. Each airplane imposes its own demands upon a pilot, and the F-100 was the first of a new breed. Because of this, all personnel transferred to it were given an extra intensive training. With the revolutionary advance to supersonic flight, pilots needed to start training all over again, because jets not only greatly increase speeds, but they drastically reduce the pilot's room for error. In combat against Japanese Zeros and North Korean and Chinese MiG-15s, the American military learned that advanced pilot training and tactical discipline can overcome technical disadvantages. The Zeros and MiGs were superior aircraft to many of those pitted against them, but they were frequently outperformed because of their pilots' limited skills. But When an advanced pilot is put into a superior plane, the road to survival and victory is a more certain one. This is what the United States did with the Sentry fighters and their crews. Korea had taught many lessons about area warfare. It was learned that strategic campaigns aimed at destroying an opponent's means of production were sometimes of dubious value, especially if your opponent didn't have the means of making war, but rather relied on an outside supplier. It became confident that there was a vast gulf between world war and limited war. In a limited struggle, aerial warfare became a matter of maintaining air superiority, interdicting the enemy's supplies, and supporting ground troops through battlefront strikes. The F-100 became more and more a tactical fighter bomber. There were faster interceptors and more extensive Mach 2 long-range strike aircraft, but the Super Sabre became the primary battlefield support weapon. Only 203 of the Interceptor A models were ever built. The following C model was a fighter bomber, and 476 of these appeared. The fully dedicated attack version, the F-100D, was built in far greater numbers. 1,274 were produced. The C and D models were out-and-out attack aircraft. The combination of high-speed landing and considerable bulk made the F-100 difficult to stop on landing. If the landing chute blew out, the pilot was set for a very long roll. Most of the planes of the era suffered the same problem. It relied on long concrete runways. It was just another thing that the fighter pilots at the time had to accept as a part of the job. The company had given the Super Sabre its name, but for many it was just too much of a mouthful. The planes came to be known by their crew as Huns, a contraction of F-100. Including 2 C trainers and 2 prototypes, 2,294 were built. The last of these was delivered in October 1959. From 1957, they equipped 16 U.S. Air Force fighter wings and were a vital weapon in the American arsenal. The limited speed of the F-100 design around Mach 1.25 prompted a redevelopment effort to make a plane that could approach Mach 2. Features were added to gear the aircraft for tactical fighter-bomber missions. These features soon came to dominate the design and included a recess in the hull providing semi-submerged nuclear weapon storage. This innovation was actually rediscovered 30 years later and given the name conformal storage. To safely eject the bombs from this recess, the air intake for the engine was shifted to the top of the fuselage, as it had with the Hun. Tactical consideration came to totally dominate the F-100B. Air Force approval to proceed with the design was given on June 11, 1954. This was followed a month later by the issue of a new designation for the aircraft. The F-100D became the F-107. By that time, the changes had become so radical to the F-107A, really little had left in common with the Hun. The fuselage, in addition to its short, thin intake, was 50% longer than the 100. Like a Super Sabre, the F-107 featured many innovations, including an all-movable vertical tail surface, invariable air intake ducts. The plane had also a multitude of built-in equipment, including chaff dispensers, radar beacons, maneuverable autopilot, and computerized stability augmentation. With this avionics package, the F-107A was really a leap into the future of the electronic development. The first F-107A took flight on September 10, 1956, at Edwards Air Force Base. The test series went ahead. Though there were some minor problems evident, North American was increasingly confident that it would all be a hot seller. The 107 was in competition with the Republic F-105, which appeared to be encountering developmental problems and wasn't ready to fly. The fly-omps were postponed. North American referred to the F-107 as a Super Sabre. The biggest worry was that once the 107 won the contract, construction would go to Republic, whose factory had no work of its own. Despite North Americans' confidence, the decision when announced came down on the side of Republic's F-105. Now, it was obvious that the F-107 would never be built in its numbers. An initial 33 examples had been contracted, but the only 3 test aircraft were fully built. The F-107 was left with the bitter consolation of being one of the best planes not to win an Air Force contract. But the F-107's failure didn't negate the F-100's success, and the Super Sabre soon took its place in the front line of the U.S. Air Force. The late 50s and early 60s was a time of peace, and North America took the chance to refine the plane. The F-100B model, which introduced integrated refueling gear, carried an astounding array of non-nuclear stores. Over 75 weapons, bomb racks, ECM pods, and launchers for rockets, mines, flares, and sundry other attachments were compatible with the plane. The D had a number of significant adjustments, including the landing flaps, greater wing area, and a taller tail. Over the years, the C and D models appeared in a number of many variations. With some different cockpit layouts, 148D models were even equipped with zero-length launch. In 1962, an extensive program was begun to standardize the existing Huns. The program took until 1965 to complete, with an average of 60 days spent to modify each plane. But after the refit, Tactical Air Command finally had what it wanted: a fleet of advanced combat-ready F-100s. The F-100 went to war on the 9th of June 1964. Sent to strike a target in the tiny nation of Laos, 8 pilots flying F-100s attacked a path to Laos stronghold at a reprisal raid. This was a retaliation for the shooting down of a Navy reconnaissance plane. It would only be the first of hundreds of missions flown over Southeast Asia, where, time and time again, the plane would prove its worth in battle. From the first raid onward, the Huns' involvement gradually escalated. In March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began. The United States had become fully entangled in the conflict, and, as the leading tactical fighter on the spot, so did the F-100. Vietnam lacked landing fields of jet-powered aircraft, and the U.S. rapidly began building new installations. These included new bases at Vienois, Saint Reng, Phuket, and Tua. All would see immense Super Sabre activity in the years to come. At many locations in Vietnam, pairs of 10,000-foot runways were built together with accommodation, administration, and maintenance facilities. In terms of modern airfields, South Vietnam became one of the most richly endowed nations on Earth. At the peak of their deployment, 490 F-100s were operating from South Vietnamese bases. Other units were stationed in Thailand. Aircrafts and units were rotated so that the most of the Air Force's Sabres saw action at one time or another. Even the two-seat traders arrived on the scene, to be re-equipped as the first Wild Weasel aircraft. They would soon be wreaking devastation on enemy anti-aircraft installations. In 1966, the base at Phan Run was one of the first to receive an all F-100 fighter wing. It remained a center of Super Sabre activity throughout the war. At one time, 140 operated from the field. By the middle of 1967, 4 fighter wings, the 3rd, 31st, 35th, and 37th, were operating the Hum in Vietnam. Although histories of the Vietnam Air War might make only passing reference to the F-100s, it's not because they weren't there in numbers, perhaps not as glamorous as other claims. Their contribution to the war effort was irreplaceable. In long-range strikes against North Vietnam, the Super Sabre's weakness became evident when compared to the newer F-105 and F-4. In such company, the F-100 was definitely outclassed. However, the F-100 served admirably as the aerial artillery so desperately needed by U.S. ground troops. At times, this was the most important test performed by the Air Force, especially to the grunts toughing it out below. To the F-100s operating with forward air controllers or FACs would drop their loads with devastating effect. Their missions can be described simply: briefing, takeoff, refueling, flying to a set of coordinates, rendezvousing with the FAC, locating and attacking targets, finally heading back to the base for more ordnance. A clinical description for what was a devastating endeavor. Pattern of the missions was repetitive, and those missions were flown in vast numbers. As early as 1969, the 4 wings stationed in South Vietnam had flown more combat missions than the combined total of the thousands of Ki-51 Mustangs engaged in World War II. The intensity never let up, and airfields in South Vietnam became the busiest in the world. In January 1967, figures for the base at Vienois showed 65,000 takeoffs and landings. This translates to 1 every 42 seconds for 31 days. Many of those were F-100s. In light of this, the word busy takes on a new and fuller meaning. As soon as the plane arrived back at base, a de-arming crew cleared the guns and reset the safety pins. Only then could the flurry of maintenance, fueling, and rearming begin. With the crew chiefs checking and rechecking the plane during the process, they were quickly readied for the next action. In practice, the Huns would fly 2 missions a day. Operational readiness figures achieved by the F-100s in Vietnam sometimes registered above 95%, which was a credit to the planes and their crews. The 31st Tactical Fighter Wing operated 5 squadrons of F-100s. This meant that its base, Tiwa, had the highest concentration of Huns in South Vietnam. In addition to its 3 regular squadrons, 2 Air National Guard squadrons were attached to it. The National Guard forces deployed to Vietnam proved to be among the most effective units in the theater, partly due to the age and experience of the pilots and, in part, of the stability of their personnel. These squadrons shot down the old flying club image of the Air National Guard. Instead, they proved to be a strong, invaluable reserve. After their performance under fire, the F-100s phased out of Guard service were replaced with brand new aircraft. In earlier days, they would have been issued hand-me-downs from the regular Air Force. In fact, General George Brown stated that the best 5 F-100 squadrons in Vietnam were National Air Guard units. These 5 included the 2 Guard units attached to the 31st Wing, Atwila, the 136th from New York, and the 188th from New Mexico. Tiwa was another of the new bases begun in May of 1966. By November of that same year, F-100s were operating from the airstrip there. Its temporary aluminum matting runway was still in use long after a concrete runway was laid beside it in 1967. The installation was finally abandoned in mid-1970. With its seemingly endless rounds of raids of replenishment, the activity of TWA wasn't much different from the other F-100 bases of the war. The 31st brought with it about 110 aircraft. 44 National Guard planes were later added, making a total of over 150 Huns. Day and night, the routines at the base went on, with the men working the minimum of 6 days a week to keep up with the deadly rotation of strikes. By the time a plane was ready for its mission, it would be loaded with fuel, ammunitions, and stores to the point where a pilot needed every inch of the airstrip just to take off. Tuy Wa's runway faced out to sea, and, with mountains at the other end of the strip, most landings and takeoff went over the beach. The view may have been nice, but variable sea breezes averaging around 25 knots and blowing across the runways tended to complicate matters. F-100 missions fell into 2 basic categories: planned strikes perceived by extensive briefings, and combat emergencies, responses to urgent calls for help from forward air controllers or Army units. F-100s also joined in pilot rescue operations, sometimes for lighting a wall of suppressive fire encircling enemy troops. The aircraft was fast, and its bases were spread over all of South Vietnam. Planes would often be in the air and over a target within minutes. Sometimes, the men on the ground would call down strikes at only 50 yards from their own positions. This is a tribute to the planes and their pilots, because the grunts on the ground would have to be far more wary for any calling of help, if the Super Sabres hadn't established a solid reputation for getting there fast and hitting only what they shot at. The need for an extreme accuracy in supporting ground troops was an additional and not inconsiderable burden on already tense pilots. Vietnam was a major testing ground for U.S. military hardware, and some of it turned out to be terribly inadequate. The Bullpup missile was a case in point. Against entrenched targets, the Taugo-controlled Bullpup wasn't much more than a nuisance, even if their aim was true. And they were less than a total success against reinforced bridges, which were just the kind of target most likely to justify their expensive use. They may have represented the cutting edge of technology one time, but in battle, they proved to a lack of cutting edge of their own. Some of the smart weaponry that showed up later was far more effective and represented a revolution in weaponry that few could have envisioned. Most of the work of the Huns was done with basic ordnance like tumbling, unfamed napalm canisters. And 500 and 750-pound iron bombs of World War II design. In addition, there were 4 cannons, each with 200 rounds, which gave the Super Sabre its lethal strafing power. By 1970, replacement of the F-100s with F-4s and F-111s was proceeding rapidly. Many of the airframes had passed 5,000 hours, and the F-100's age was telling. It had been an old design when it entered in combat, outclassed by opposing MiGs. It was simply no longer in the race as an air superiority weapon. However, it made quite a name for itself in its support of the Army and was also the first Wild Weasel aircraft. As the war drew to a close, the F-100s left Vietnam, unit by unit. The last of the 35th Tactical Wing F Dang Reng disappeared in July 1971. Huns flew 360,283 sorties in Vietnam, more operational sorties than any other type in that war. 243 of the planes were lost, 198 of those in combat. The majority of the F-100s used in foreign air forces were second-hand. In 1958, the French were the first foreign country to receive new Super Sabres. They operated 100 of them, with 15 of the F models and 85s. These remained in French service until 1980. Denmark also had 3 squadrons of Huns and operated them until 1982, and Taiwan received and operated second-hand A models which were later upgraded. By far, the largest customer for second-hand Super Sabres was Turkey. Out of the over 300 eventually purchased, the Turks reportedly still have some F-100s in storage, but generally, the Super Sabre wasn't a great foreign sales success for North American. And, with the failure of the F-107, they were left without any fighter contracts whatsoever. But North American didn't give up on the fighter-building business. On the contrary, they were already working on the Mach 3 F-108 Rapier, which, like the XK-70 Valkyrie, was to be another step into the future. In June 1957, the company was given a contract to develop a proposal that had been initiated in 1955. The plane envisaged would be an interceptor capable of operating at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. It would have been able to fly 1,000 miles from its base, launching a missile and be back home and on the ground in half an hour. The aim was to destroy incoming missiles or bombers far out at sea. Unfortunately, the plane would have carried an enormous price tag, and after viewing the mock-up in January 1959, the Air Force backed off. On September 23, 1959, North American advised of the Rapier program's cancellation after only 3 generations, all of which had been illustrious ones. The company's days of fighter construction were at an end. After Vietnam, Huns remained in service solely with the National Guard, and by 1972 had completely phased out of the Air Force use. But almost no low-time planes were left. Having become a relic, they were gradually phased out. They had been with the Guard for over 21 years, and several pilots had logged over 5,000 flying hours in them. The last operational National Guard flight was on the 10th of November 1979. The only flights after that were ferrying operations. The F-100 is now a thing of the past. It was the product of an experimental age and bridged two separate eras between 1949 and 1979. A lot had happened in aviation. The plane had gone from the world record holder to a non-contender even before its production cycle was over. And although it had no fancy avionics, pilots grew to love it both for the plane it was and for the hard lessons it taught them. Among old Hun jockeys, there is little dissent about what it's worth. At one time, the subject of considerable doubt, the Super Sabre ended its career with a proud reputation, and with the distinction of its performance in Vietnam. That reputation is sure to live on for a very long time.
The origin of the Vigilante program can be loosely traced to an event that would become America's answer to Pearl Harbor. On the afternoon of April 18, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle and his crack volunteer group prepared to embark on a surprise attack on Tokyo. This was no ordinary air raid. The attack was to be carried out by 16 Army Air Corps bombers.
As the carrier plows through heavy seas, one bomber after another soars from the flight deck, pointed for Japan. The sea grows rougher, the weather worse, but not one plane fails to get into the air. Taking the gale in its teeth, each bomber sets its course for carefully prearranged military objectives in Japan.
Deployed from an unlikely airstrip, the USS Hornet, the events of that rainy afternoon were unprecedented, not only because of the unique inter-service cooperation, but it proved that a Navy carrier was an effective platform for long-range bombing. The American strategy was effective. Doolittle's raiders had dealt an important psychological blow to a seemingly invulnerable adversary. The role of the aircraft carrier in this attack would not be forgotten. Just 3 years later, American planes again dropped bombs on Japan. Only this time, the symbolism of the attack was overshadowed by the destructive power of the weapon used. The onset of a nuclear age brought with it a change in military thinking. Having delivered the final blow to Japan, the US Air Force assumed the mantle as the sole possessor of the nuclear endgame. As a post-war euphoria gave way to a Cold War reality, the Boeing B-47 and later Boeing B-52 Stratofortress were fit with the role of nuclear delivery. Long-range strategic bombing became a defensive priority. Now equipped with an aircraft that could reach the Soviet heartland from American bases, the aircraft carrier was deemed redundant. Struggling to find a role in the era of the strategic bomber, the Navy put forth a nuclear-capable aircraft of its own. The North American A.J. Savage was clearly the result of the desire for a nuclear bomber combined with an inherent distrust of pure jet aircraft. The two propulsion engines provided the security of low-speed carrier operations, while a single jet engine mounted in the center of the fuselage provided the speed, with two turning and one burning. The Savage was a clever hybrid. However, by the time it reached the carrier decks, it was already becoming obsolete. By 1949, the Douglas Company had begun developing its jet-powered follow-on, the A-3D Skywarrior. When the Navy ordered the Douglas Skywarrior in 1949, it was clear that pure jet propulsion was gaining thrust aboard carrier decks. Like most early nuclear bombers, the Skywarrior was a massive plane. 76 feet in length and 72-foot wingspan made it the largest plane ever to be deployed from the deck of a carrier. However, like most early large jets, the Skywarrior was relatively slow. Unable to reach supersonic speeds, it was deemed vulnerable to rapidly improving Soviet air defense. Because of its sheer size, the Skywarrior was disliked by deck handlers. The absence of an ejection system was unsettling to its 3 crew members. In fact, Many pilots joke that the 3D stood for all three dead. While the mammoth Skywarrior assumed the more passive roles of electronic warfare and tanking, the Navy set out to find a nuclear bomber that would go faster than ever before. At the North American Aviation plant in Columbus, Ohio, the challenge of creating a new nuclear bomber was given full priority. Headed by Frank Compton, the Columbus designers took the initiative in preempting the Navy's request for a new bomber. Beginning with sketches and slide rules, the small group delved enthusiastically into the uncharted waters of the aerodynamic unknown. By 1954, the implications of technological growth had a profound effect on the American bomber tactics. Advancements in radar-guided surface-to-air missiles had all but nullified the safety of high altitudes. With this in mind, the Navy conducted a secretive mission to explore the alternative to a high-altitude nuclear attack. On this mission, an AJ Savage would take off from Spain, fly all the way to Paris, and back. Under the French radar, the plane was never detected. The implications of a low-altitude penetration for nuclear delivery were noticed by the engineers of Columbus. This low-altitude requirement was not incorporated into their initial design, which was dubbed the North American General Purpose Attack Weapon, or NAGPA.
We initially designed a low-altitude version with all of the systems in it, the inertial navigation, the automatic systems, we had the rocket engine in it, and all of those things. And we called that the NAGPA, and that was presented to the Navy in 1953. So the Navy studied it. It was our own unsolicited proposal, and they thought, well, that's a good idea to do all of those things, which we ended up doing in the Vigilante, but they said, how about making it supersonic? So we packed our bags and went home for about a year, and then came back with a supersonic version, which is the present-day Vigilante.
The North American design was dubbed the A-3J. The intended role of the A-3J was simple. It would penetrate the Soviet heartland, bringing with it a nuclear bomb. Its blazing speed would be the key to its survival. The quest for higher speeds resulted in an airframe like no other at the time. North American test pilot Ed Gillespie remembers his first impressions of the Vigilante.
In those days, we always felt if an airplane looked good, it was going to fly good. Well, the Vigilante certainly looked good. It looked like it was going Mach 2 and it was sitting on the deck. I couldn't believe that our engineering staff could stuff all the goodies in it that they finally did and still make the airplane carrier suitable or have the range or the legs that we finally ended up with. But it was such a good-looking airplane, and it still is to this day, that you just wanted it. It was a Cadillac of the fleet.
The Navy's requirements were stringent, to say the least. The Vigilante needed to be launched from a carrier with zero headwind, yet it also needed to cruise beyond Mach 2. Aerodynamically, this was a contradiction. The lift required for the carrier takeoff suggests the need for larger wings. However, larger wing areas prevent the plane from reaching high speeds. Engineers cope with this dilemma by making the wing much thinner than was generally accepted. It was argued by some that the aerodynamic compromises put forth in the Vigilante were drawbacks created by an overly stringent Navy. After all, since the aircraft carriers are generally moving, it would be extremely rare for a plane to be catapulted with zero headwind. This requirement was later relaxed, but not until after the engineering staff had taken extraordinary steps in making a flexible airframe that would revolutionize the way military aircraft are designed. While the Vigilante was taking shape, the Air Force was making progress on their own supersonic bomber programs. Aircraft evolution during the Cold War was rapid. The mighty B-52 was soon to be outperformed by the B-58 Hustler. The Hustler was not only supersonic, it could fly at Mach 2. However, just as the Hustler was entering service, the Air Force began the quest for even higher speeds. Here, at the North American Aviation Plant in Palmdale, California, a new airplane was taking shape. The B-70 Valkyrie promised to be the fastest bomber in the world. The Strategic Air Command was enamored by its potential. By 1964, they would have a bomber that would be impossible to catch. "9,000 miles away, the American bomber programs were already making an impression. The American pursuit of supersonic bombers posed a great challenge to the Soviet military. Soviet airspace was immense, and an unwelcome bomber could penetrate the vast areas for even the fastest Soviet fighter of the time to catch it. Soviet aircraft design. Back at the Columbus plant, the Vigilante was beginning to take shape. By 1958, it was clear that this plane was revolutionary. It was the first plane to fly by wire controls, the first to have a heads-up display, terrain avoidance, and a fully integrated inertial navigation, bombing, and electric warfare system. Advanced aluminum alloys were also introduced. However, of all the Vigilante's firsts, there is one that few people know about.
One of the things that we did in 1955 was look at the so-called stealth characteristics of the airplane, which now are high tech. And we checked the airplane. We built a range out here on the airfield where we could put a model and we could rotate the model. It was a copper screen model, and impinge radar signals onto it and measure the feedback. So we would rotate the model, and we actually designed the airplane so that its radar reflectivity was concentrated at 2 points off of each side of the wingtips. And of course, when you're flying by something, why, you get a flash, but you don't get a large response. So we actually designed stealth into the Vigilante.
Despite differences in both culture and language between the United States and the Soviet Union, aerodynamics are universal. When different engineers independently strive for a similar requirement, their conclusions will also be similar. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that as early as 1958, the same year that the Vigilante first took to the air, Soviet engineers were filmed studying a model similar in design to that of the Vigilante. Despite the work done by Soviet designers on their own, it is likely that Columbus, Ohio frequently became the unofficial host of the KGB agents. It would be hard for them to miss the sleek American bomber sitting out on the tarmac.
They could have stood out here on the airport and taken pictures of it in 1958 when we made our first flight. There's really nothing covert about the Vigilante as far as its being there, and certainly the characteristics of it were secret. But the shape of it, looking at it, so I'm sure they had plenty of people, which they had all over the world, standing out here at Columbus, taking pictures of every airplane.
Nikolai Matchuk and Lev Shalengaya of the MiG Design Bureau were put in charge of the Soviet answer to the American bombers. An interceptor needs to be faster than the plane it chases. Therefore, MiG designers began the ambitious construction of a fighter that could push beyond Mach 3. This daunting task faced by the Soviets was aggravated by the progress being made back at the States. On the last day of August 1958, North American test pilot Dick Wenzel took to the air over Columbus. After the maiden flight, the Vigilante's prowess as a speedster began to truly shine. In June of 1960, famed aviatrix Jackie Cochran climbed into the back seat of the Vigilante, becoming the first woman to fly beyond Mach 2. Later that year, the Vigilante set yet another record when Commander Leroy Heath climbed to over 91,000 feet while carrying a 2,200-pound payload. Although the Navy was enamored by the Vigilante's performance, certain residents of the southeastern Ohio were less impressed.
We broke a lot of windows in the early days. One lady sued us because of the loss of her parrot, had a heart attack, I recall that. We also had a very definite problem with a gentleman down in southeastern Ohio who owned a dynamite factory, and it was right under our supersonic corridor. And he finally realized who was causing he was losing so many man hours to people bailing out the windows and so on when we would shock his employees that he finally got in touch with us, said, please, I think it's you guys, don't do it anymore. And indeed, we did move our corridor away from him, and he thanked us. He wasn't losing the time anymore.
To a pilot flying a new plane, the ejection seat is the most important piece of equipment on board. Bucking the trend toward the British Martin Baker variety, North American designed its own. And in fact, came up with the first seat to safety eject the pilot both above and below the speed of sound. A Navy pilot is not necessarily in the air when he needs to get out of the plane. In the dangerous world of carrier operations, escaping from a submerged plane can be the key to survival. Dramatic footage shows both crew members successfully ejecting at zero altitude, however the system was not error-free.
One time, I was flying at 42,000 feet on a first production flight, and a misrigged canopy, and this is the only time it ever happened, I might add, suddenly blew off. I lost my canopy at 42,000 feet at 1.42 Mach. And of course, it was stunned me. It just explosive decompression. I was alone. Explosive decompression. And when I realized, I thought I had ejected. But seconds later, I realized I hadn't. I throttled back, speed brakes out. My visor was down fully. My mask was on very tight. Of course, explosive decompression kicked it out. But when I finally got out of control, I realized I was still in the airplane, and the airplane was unhurt, except that I was open cockpit. So therefore, I claim, and nobody's ever I don't believe that anybody's ever come close, but we have the fastest open cockpit flying record.
At the beginning of 1961, 2 Vigilantes were moved from Columbus, Ohio to Kirtland Air Force Base to begin the program's most difficult and complex series of tests, bomb delivery. The method employed to release a bomb remains perhaps the most bizarre chapter in the Vigilante story. Instead of dropping bombs like a conventional bomber, the bomb was ejected straight out through an opening in the tail of the plane. In the early 50s, high and fast were the most important elements in a bombing attack. However, with improvements in air defense systems, it became apparent that sneaking under the radar was the safer bet. For pilots carrying a nuclear bomb, this meant learning some extraordinary tactics.
Our initial method was to fly the airplane straight and level at Mach 2 at 70,000 feet and drop the bomb out of the back of the airplane. As it would come out, the tail cone would come off the airplane, the bomb would come out like this and then go. And of course, the airplane was at 70,000 feet, so there wasn't an escape problem up there. Later on, of course, then we also decided that we could come in low, right on the deck, and pitch and automatically or manually program the airplane up and to about a 40-degree attitude where the bomb would then come out. And as the airplane continued, the bomb would come off and go towards the target. The airplane would then continue around and do an Immelman turn and then go the other way and escape. The other way was an over-the-shoulder where you hit the target, you were right over the target. This was your IP, or your initial point. You pull up right there and right over the target, you released the bomb, you continued around like this. The bomb would go straight up and come straight down, and luckily by the time it hit you, you were off and away.
For pilots, these hair-raising maneuvers were taxing enough without having to worry about finding and hitting the target. This was a job for the Radar Attack Navigator, or RAN, who sat in the back seat. Responsible for target and checkpoint acquisition, terrain avoidance, and a host of other duties. The RAN is crucial to the mission.
the fact that the RAN, or the radar attack navigator, was in a compartment completely isolated behind the pilot with no front view meant that you had to work very hard at coordinating the mission, getting your cockpit-to-cockpit chatter down to where it was both brief but informative. And as the navigator in the back would run sensors, navigate the airplane, the pilot in front is looking for visual cues and maneuvering the target in the end game. It was a wonderful experience to form the teaming that you saw between pilots and navigators.
Before each mission, the RAN sets the course the pilot will follow en route to the target. Flying below radar means that mountains are as dangerous as the enemy defenses. This is especially true at night or in poor weather. Former Vigilante pilot Captain Joe Dyer is well aware of the importance of the man who sat behind him.
Well, I think the RAN that is responsible for me being here today was made up for one of those lapses in attention. I was a young aviator. We were flying low altitude and high speed, and after a few hundred hours, you got too comfortable at doing that. And I was looking down at a chart or my kneeboard card. The nose of the airplane dipped a little bit. The guy in the back seat says, "Hey, Joe, watch your attitude." I looked down 50 feet. Recovered, nighttime, by the way. I gently recovered. Didn't say anything about it, but my knees were knocking in the front, and I remember thinking as we turned to the next target and the navigator was talking to me, "Gosh, you ought to be quiet. You know, you're almost dead back there."
During an attack, checkpoints such as islands or mountains were displayed on a television system. Such checkpoints were used to ensure the pilot was keeping true to course. Because onboard radar defeats the purpose of trying to remain invisible, the navigator was given a state-of-the-art interior navigation system that provided him an accurate reading of his location, without betraying his position. To ensure that the plane was keeping true to its course, the navigator would occasionally flash his radar to verify checkpoints and correct any navigational error. Should enemy interceptors pick up the radar flashes, an electronic countermeasure indicator will warn the pilot of incoming fighters. It will then confuse enemy radar by emitting false information concerning the whereabouts of the Vigilante. Vigilante's problems were political, not aerodynamic. The Air Force had long argued that the strategic attack role was exclusively an Air Force mission. The Navy disagreed. By 1960, discourse over the Navy's role in the strategic mission had snowballed into the bitter inter-service, rivalry, and debate. The Vigilante was a casualty.
The Air Force convinced Congress that the Navy shouldn't have a strategic mission, and so we converted the airplane from a 70,000-foot Mach 2 airplane very successfully to a low-altitude, long-range reconnaissance airplane.
Enter the RA-5, R being reconnaissance. The shift from attack to reconnaissance took place just as the Vigilante was entering service with the Navy. The first Vigilantes were delivered to Naval Air Station Sanford in Florida in 1961. By January of the following year, they entered squadron service. During this period, the heated debate over whether the Navy should have a role in the nuclear deterrent cast a shadow on the Vigilante's long-awaited arrival into fleet service. Anticipating that the Air Force would get its way, the Navy recognized its potential in a very different role. The Vigilante was well suited for the role of aerial reconnaissance. Fully loaded with cameras, the recon pilot's only defense is speed. Capable of blazing beyond Mach 2, the Vigilante was clearly fast enough for the job. However, even more important than speed was the fact that it could be launched from a carrier. Unrestricted by the diplomatic and logistical problems encountered when operating from foreign airfields, the Vigilante gave naval intelligence and eye in all corners around the world.
This airplane carried fixed focal length cameras from 3 inches out to 12 inches, had an 18-inch panoramic camera that would let you stand miles offshore but still get excellent photography of areas of interest. It was also an all-weather machine because it had in that canoe underneath the airplane a side-looking radar or an image-forming radar that would go through clouds that would bring back image quality or reconnaissance quality photography. The 18-inch pan camera would give you wonderful standoff, almost the quality of today's space cameras, in that you could read a license plate in downtown, probably still classified cities, coastal cities at great distance.
In 1964, the first reconnaissance vigilantes joined the fleet. During this period, the Cold War was again heating up, and there was no shortage of areas upon which the government wanted to keep a close eye on. When the Vigilante returned to the ship, intelligence information recorded on tape and film are rushed into a highly specialized group of rooms several floors below the flight deck. This area, known as the Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, is where all the processing and interpretation takes place. The Vigilante pilots had three basic ways of gathering intelligence. One was to fly at very high altitudes to get a picture of activity deep within enemy territory. Another way was to briefly sneak across the beach very low to obtain a detailed picture of enemy defenses several miles inland. The third was a short-range beach reconnaissance to give details of possible landing assault. All of the sensory data, whether optical or non-optical, was correlated and analyzed in conjunction with each other to provide an integrated analysis of the hostile military activity. Such intelligence is then passed on to the air wing. From this information, tactical mission planning or orders of battle can be prepared and effectively carried out. If an airstrike is called for, the attacking planes will know exactly which targets to attack and which radar signature to jam.
3 miles, something like that.
The information provided by the Vigilante is tactical, meaning that it gives a continuous and updated picture of the enemy during a wartime situation. Tactical recon was nothing new to the US Navy. During World War II, Navy Wildcats were fit to carry large cameras. Stationed at forward bases in the South Pacific, photo pilots flew over Japanese Hell Islands before an amphibious assault. Navy bomber pilots studied the photographs and picked their targets before setting on their way. During the Korean War, aerial reconnaissance missions were being flown off the decks of carriers. Photographic versions of the Grumman F-9F Panther brought back detailed pictures of Kim Il-sung's task forces, supply depots, anti-aircraft batteries, and troop concentrations. Later in the war, these same cameras would photograph large-scale troop buildups in the north. Troops that were discovered to be Chinese. From before the Incheon landing and through to the end of hostilities, photographic intelligence proved to be a decisive factor. The prevailing notion that the atomic bomb would deter any future conflicts had been proven false. The carrier emerged once again as the long arm of the US military, and reconnaissance planes became the eye of the fleet. Following the Korean War, US foreign policy was directed to another area of the world, the Middle East. In July of 1958, civil unrest in Lebanon threatened the already precarious political standing in the region. Also, some 2,500 Americans were living in and around the Beirut area. In preparation for an amphibious landing, photographic versions of the F-9F Cougar took over the skies of Lebanon, bringing back detailed pictures of troop buildups along the Damascus Road leading from Syria. These pictures were then used to determine exactly where the Marines should come ashore. While Navy planes were busy with tactical reconnaissance, the Air Force was keeping an eye on the US military's main area of interest, the Soviet Union. On May 1, 1960, a Lockheed U-2 took off from Pakistan on a high-altitude recon mission that would dramatically change the defense relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U-2, flown alone by France's Gary Powers, never made it to Norway. On May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev announced that Powers' U-2 had been brought down 1,400 miles inside Soviet territory. Khrushchev charged America with deliberate aggression and stated that the world could be pushed to the brink of war. The ill-fated spy flight was a diplomatic disaster for the Eisenhower administration. For the State Department, it meant apologies and damage control. For the Pentagon, however, it revealed the need for a faster spy plane. When the Central Intelligence Agency was in charge of strategic reconnaissance missions, the Vigilante was being readied for the entrance into the fleet. Its prowess in the areas of speed and altitude had not gone unnoticed by the CIA. After all, the plane had been initially designed to penetrate Soviet airspace with a nuclear bomb on board. If it could penetrate Soviet airspace with a nuclear bomb, it could certainly do so with cameras. New engines specifically designed to sustain the plane at a high-altitude supersonic dash were considered by both the Navy and the CIA. However, as the CIA project was still in the planning stages, a conflict in a different part of the world was beginning to boil.
Destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked, it replied to the attack, continued to carry out its mission today, and will do so the remainder of this week in the same waters. The President has asked the destroyer force be doubled and with an aircraft, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. And as I think you know, he's issued instructions that in the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
On August 5, 1964, the Vietnam War unofficially began. Airstrikes targeted North Vietnamese fuel deposits, suspected military installations, bridges, and roadways. However, there was one major problem. Maps of North Vietnam were notoriously inaccurate. In some instances, these maps were as much as 4 miles in error. The problem this presented to American pilots is obvious. On the ground, American troops were forced to adapt to the guerrilla tactics they faced in both jungles and towns. From the day the first American soldiers set foot in Vietnam, it was clear that fighting such an elusive enemy would prove difficult. A decade of war had left the North Vietnamese well adapted to an ambush style of warfare. Inaccurate maps aggravated the problem for American soldiers. Errors up to 4 miles created confusion about the location of crucial landmarks like hills, rivers, and villages. Precision is imperative in close air support. With absolutely no room for error, the need for accurate maps was never more clear. The Vigilante pilots entered the war in late 1964 aboard the USS Ranger. Shortly thereafter, additional Vigilante squadrons joined the combat area aboard the USS Kitty Hawk, Enterprise Forrestal, Constellation, and America. The first task of the Vigilante crews was to solve the problem of poor intelligence and inaccurate maps. In just a 2-week period, the Vigilante collected the imagery of the entire Vietnamese area, providing the US military with reliable maps for the first time. However, What the maps did not show was the complex network of trails and bridges upon which the North Vietnamese funneled supplies to the south. The Ho Chi Minh Trail frustrated the American military. Cutting off this relentless flow of supplies became a priority. However, finding it was a different story. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not one trail, but a vast network of trails. Complicating this was the fact that most of these trails were shrouded in a thick jungle canopy. Despite this, US warplanes took aim at whatever appeared to be part of this vast supply route. As the war progressed, the Ho Chi Minh Trail would become the focus of the most concentrated bombing campaigns of the entire war. Despite the onslaught of bombs, supplies continued to pour into the south. In an attempt to reveal North Vietnamese supply routes, American planes began dumping massive amounts of what was then deemed to be non-toxic defoliant. The use of Agent Orange proved difficult and ineffective. A much cleaner way of looking within the jungle canopy was carried out by the Vigilante. The infrared sensors aboard the plane could pick up heat energy from trucks or other activity in the trail. In the first months of the war, the Vigilante had earned a reputation as an exceptional recon plane. However, it had also established a less flattering reputation. Because of its sheer size and high landing speed, the Vigilante was notoriously difficult to bring aboard a carrier.
The Vigilante community was made up of outstanding aviators, but that's because we very quickly weeded out those that had trouble at the carrier. The carrier, to this day, is the most demanding aspect of naval aviation, and that's where Vigilante pilots, the successful ones, absolutely excelled.
By the cessation of bombing in 1968, the Rolling Thunder policies had transformed many areas of North Vietnam into a decimated moonscape. But the North Vietnamese proved resilient, as rebuilding commenced immediately when the planes disappeared. Working in conjunction with American bombers became the primary role of Vigilante crews. Before an attack, Vigilante pilots would fly over a likely North Vietnamese target. After the bombing run, the Vigilante would again fly over the target to assess the damage. Because he enjoyed the element of surprise, the Vigilante pilot usually encountered little resistance before an attack. However, the post-strike flyover was a different matter.
Some of the airplanes in Vietnam were lost because their tactics were to follow up a bomb delivery mission with reconnaissance, and pretty soon the Vietnamese were smart and they knew that after they got a few bombs, they were also going to get a Vigilante.
After a massive bombing raid, North Vietnamese gunners were ready at the trigger. In the north, anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. The sound of an American plane would cause the sky to erupt into a violent hail of artillery. The policy of post-strike reconnaissance proved costly. In fact, more Vigilantes were lost over Vietnam than any other Navy plane during the war. 11 of the 18 airplanes lost were attributed to anti-aircraft artillery. Proof that when flying at low levels, even the fastest and most sophisticated airplane is vulnerable to the oldest form of anti-aircraft defense. The pieces of the airplanes seen on the boat are from a Vigilante that left the USS Kitty Hawk on its last mission. May 19, 1967. Vigilantes were flown off the decks of carriers up until the ceasefire in 1973. Designed to fly against the best Soviets had to offer, the Vigilante spent most of its career flying against a more ambiguous enemy over the skies of Southeast Asia. For American pilots, this was typical Cold War reality. During the brush fires and wars of containment that characterized the Cold War, the aircraft carrier was the strong arm of American foreign policy. For almost 20 years, the Vigilante was the eye of the fleet. And during this tenure, the Vigilante community developed a distinguished reputation.
The Vigilante community really was just that. It was a small group of about a dozen fleet squadrons, one replacement air group, would service both East Coast and West Coast ships out of, first of all, Sanford, Florida. Then we moved up to Albany, Georgia, and finally down at Key West, where we finally wrapped up the show. But it was a small community in that everyone knew everybody, and we had our full collection of characters. We probably had a resident village idiot or two. We had bears with sore heads, but far and away, the community was made up of very, very professional people that epitomized what in the aviation business we call crew coordination.
In 1979, the Vigilante retired from service with the Navy. Without question, it was the most effective and successful reconnaissance airplane ever to operate off the deck of a carrier. Even by standards extent, nearly 2 decades after its heyday, the Vigilante's level of performance remains extraordinary. The technological and mechanical sophistication introduced by its designers have left a distinct impression on modern aviation. One of the Vigilante's major design firsts were its horizontal ramp intakes for its engines. Such intakes are now commonplace on military planes. One look at the Navy's F-14 Tomcat reveals how much was borrowed from the sleek design of the Vigilante. The Air Force's mighty F-15 Eagle has also borrowed heavily from the four-sided Vigilante designers. But whatever became of the once feared Soviet MiG-25, the Foxbat?
About a year ago, there was a picture of a Foxbat reconnaissance version. It also has the same canoe on the bottom and so forth that our RA-5C had. So I think today they are continuing to have a reconnaissance system, which we no longer have.
The MiG-25 had a fate similar to the Vigilante. When it emerged, it was deemed one of the fastest and most daunting aircrafts in the world. However, like the Vigilante, it was used most effectively when carrying cameras rather than bombs. When the Vigilante retired, with it went the Navy's ability to take an integrated picture of the battlefield. During Operation Desert Storm, it would be satellites, not airplanes, that kept an eye on the movements of Iraqi troops and Scuds. However, satellites have their drawbacks.
Desert Storm, one of the big lessons learned, quote, was tactical reconnaissance. And they still in Desert Storm had to try to get satellite data to Washington and back to Desert Storm, which was a day later instead of an hour later. Satellite has a little problem getting electronic intelligence because it only goes over once every hour and a half, you know. We can be there continuously and know exactly where we are.
With the end of the Cold War, there are now signs that dedicated tactical reconnaissance may be re-emerging as a defense priority. In the tradition of the Vigilante, an unmanned reconnaissance system currently under development promises to give the battlefield commanders an eye in the sky.
The design of the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II has surpassed 60 years. Initially intended for carrier-based operations, it swiftly evolved into one of the most significant land-based tactical aircraft in the Western world. Over 5,200 Phantoms were manufactured, and today they continue to serve in Greece, South Korea, Turkey, and Iran. Originating in the early 1950s as the McDonnell AH-1 supersonic attack aircraft, it transitioned in May 1955 into the F-4H-1 two-seat fleet defense fighter. With its Mach 2 Plus performance, the F-4 boasted an armament featuring 4 Sparrow air-to-air missiles, semi-recessed in the lower fuselage and complemented by a robust search and fire control radar. Thus, the F-4H emerged as the world's first fighter equipped with self-contained search and destroy capability. On May 27, 1958, the XF-4H-1 prototype made its debut at Lambert Field in St. Louis, with test pilot Bob Little at the controls for its inaugural flight.
Our intention on that flight was to take the airplane supersonic on its first flight. We had done that 4 years before in the F-101, and it was certainly something to be accomplished in the F-4. It didn't work out that way. Landing gear didn't come all the way up. And on that flight, a hydraulic system failed on takeoff, so had to bring the airplane in after about 20 minutes of learning how to fly it well enough so I could land it.
Despite encountering challenges during its maiden voyage, as the XF-4H taxied alongside examples of McDonnell's other major fighter program of the period, the F-101 Voodoo, it became evident that the company had a triumph on its hands. The narrative of the Phantom also encompasses General Electric, which supplied the J-79 turbojet engine. In 1951, the company embarked on developing a new axial flow engine that aimed for low weight and excellent fuel efficiency at Mach 0.9, while still possessing the strength and thrust for Mach 2 performance. To accomplish this, the J-79 incorporated innovative design elements, notably the variable stator compressor with adjustable blades and an afterburning exhaust nozzle essential for lightweight and optimal performance at very high speeds. This nozzle utilized secondary air to regulate the expansion of the primary exhaust, also serving to cool the engine, thus obviating the need for costly metallurgical solutions. Mechanically interconnected, 2 sets of nozzle fingers dynamically adjust, opening and closing to shape the exhaust for optimal balance between thrust and fuel consumption across the engine's entire operating spectrum. This innovation results in a substantial 2/3 boost in thrust, albeit at the cost of exorbitant fuel consumption. The full-scale variable stator compressor unit underwent its inaugural test in August 1953, yielding performance figures so impressive that the test crew initially suspected instrumentation malfunction. At much the same time, the afterburner was connected to a J-73 turbojet and tested with encouraging results. The integration of the afterburner with the J-79 engine culminated in the complete new engine's placement in the test cell by June 1954. Approximately 150 hours of testing on the J-79 was supplemented by an additional 800 hours on the J-73 for further evaluation. A pivotal moment in the test program occurred with the inaugural field run of the J-79 engine. Upon ignition, the test crew promptly scrutinized the instrumentation. Subsequently, with the engine throttled to idling speed, ground and flight test engineers meticulously inspected it for any signs of fuel or oil leaks and other potential failures. Once this initial examination was cleared, the engine underwent higher speed testing before being shut down. In May 1955, the groundbreaking new engine took flight, housed in a nacelle beneath the belly of a converted North American B-45 bomber. Historic footage captures the modified B-45's ascent on May 20th, 1955. After the B-45 achieved stable flight, the J-79's nacelle was extended, facilitating initial test runs to confirm its capabilities in steady, level flight. Subsequent tests included air starts, essential for any advanced engine. The J-79's performance was thoroughly assessed across various flight conditions, proving its mettle with afterburning thrust ratings of up to approximately 13,000 pounds. The inaugural flight-worthy J-79 was transported across the United States to Edwards Air Force Base in California, where it underwent unpacking, ground testing, and installation for flight trials. This process proceeded smoothly, with fuel, oil, and over 100 electrical connections established without major issues. The XF-4D-1, a prototype of the high-performance Naval Interceptor Skyray, was selected as the test aircraft for the flight trials. Ground runs were conducted at both dry and afterburning thrust levels to validate the fundamental installation. On December 8, 1955, under the command of test pilot Roy Pryor, the aircraft equipped with the J-79 engine embarked on its maiden flight. Taking off downwind to maximize runway utilization, the aircraft required approximately 6 miles of the renowned dry lake bed at Edwards, formerly known as Murrock, until 1950. The flight encompassed a climb to 18,000 feet before safely returning for an evening landing. The entire flight operation exemplified successful flight testing. The J-79 was soon cleared for operational service, and early examples of the type were installed right from the beginning of the Phantom's production run. By the late 1950s, the Phantom's prominence surged following the placement of its first production contract in December 1956. This overview of an F-4B naval model, temporarily loaned to the US Air Force, highlights the aircraft's key attributes. Positioned at the front is the pilot, with the radar officer seated behind. A ladder, visible inside the rear canopy, can be deployed to darken the cockpit, ensuring optimal conditions for viewing the radar screen. Despite being relatively spacious and conventional for the era, the cockpits are well equipped with displays and controls. Occupants are seated on Martin Baker Mach 5 ejector seats, engineered for safe ejections even at zero altitude and speeds as low as 150 miles per hour. Mach 2 performance is facilitated by the 2 fully variable ramp inlets for the J-79 engines. A splitter plate diverts the boundary layer of the slower moving air close to the fuselage, while the inlet ramp adjusts at speeds exceeding Mach 1.4 to regulate the shock wave pattern, ensuring an uninterrupted airflow into the engine. This system operates automatically, controlled by the aircraft's air data computer. Notably, Navy and Air Force Phantoms typically feature distinct tyre configurations. Both types of tyres boast the same diameter, but the Air Force variant, depicted on the left, showcases a broader design. This broader tyre offers an increased touchdown area, allowing it to be inflated to lower pressures, suitable for operations on the extended runways typically available to land-based aircraft. Positioned on the port side of the fuselage is a pneumatically extended ram air turbine, serving as an emergency power source to sustain essential systems in the event of engine failure. Operating down to a speed of 225 miles per hour, the turbine supplies electrical power, transitioning to hydraulic power for the landing systems thereafter. The centerline hardpoint for stores, Sidewinder tactical optical recognition carriage, is augmented by 4 substantial pylons situated under the wings. Along the leading edges of the wings are 3 section slats designed to maintain an even airflow over the wings and reduce stalling speed. This feature's efficacy hinges on boundary layer control, achieved by tapping air from the engine compressor and venting it through the depicted slots. This is one of the 2 trailing edge flaps, which are also fitted with boundary layer control. Similar to the leading edge system, these slots direct air tapped from the engines over the upper surface of the flap. This airflow manipulation enhances the effectiveness of these relatively small surfaces. The flaps have a maximum deflection of 60 degrees, with full flap setting employed during landing and half flap setting for takeoff. Lateral control is achieved through a combination of spoilers and ailerons, with spoilers utilized at high airspeeds and ailerons at low airspeeds. Each wing's underside features a hydraulically operated speed brake, enabling rapid deceleration from speeds as high as Mach 2.4 at any flight attitude without inducing buffet or altering pitch trim. Although extending the speed brakes during landings is safe, their effect is minimal at low speeds. The elongated low vertical tail addresses headroom constraints on US carriers' hangar decks and incorporates a powered rudder for yaw control. Beneath the powered rudder lies the vent for the fuselage's complex of 6 fuel tanks. The slab tailplane halves ensure complete pitch control under all flight conditions and are angled downward at 23 degrees to enhance directional stability by augmenting the effective side area of the rear fuselage. Positioned between the J-79 tailpipes is the arrestor hook, typically housed beneath the rear fuselage fairing but deployed during carrier landings. This feature, retained on land-based Phantoms as well, has proven invaluable for achieving short landings on runways equipped with appropriate arrestor gear. Crafted from a special high-strength alloy, the hook is engineered to withstand the immense forces encountered during arrested landings. Heat resistance in the rear fuselage is enhanced through the utilization of stainless steel, titanium, and ram air cooling. Located at the far end of the tail is the compartment for the 16-foot braking parachute, essential for reducing landing distances on standard runways. The aperture in the tail facilitates the exit of cooling air, intentionally drawn into the rear fuselage structure above the engine exhausts. Renowned for its distinctive appearance, the Phantom has always stood out in the realm of aviation aesthetics. One of these distinctive features is the power folding of the outer portion of each wing, normally angled at 12 degrees. The folding system is engineered to reduce the Phantom's width for ease of movement on carrier decks and elevators. This feature, retained on land-based Phantoms as well, has demonstrated its practicality in various operational scenarios. With the wings folded, the internal plumbing for the boundary layer control system becomes visible. The sizable nose radome accommodates the 32-inch diameter antenna of the APQ-72 main radar. Positioned beneath the nose is the fairing for the infrared scanner, serving as a backup target acquisition capability should the main radar encounter jamming or failure. The Phantom entered operational service with the US Navy in 1961, prompting rapid conversion of squadrons from older aircraft types to equip the Navy's formidable carrier force. The section illustrates key elements of carrier-borne operations, featuring F-4Bs from Fighter Squadron 74 aboard the USS Forrestal, the Atlantic Fleet's inaugural Phantom unit, also known as the Bedevilers. Prior to each mission, a meticulous briefing sets the stage, followed by flight crews donning survival equipment on top of their flight suits. Upon the command from flight operations, crews proceed to their designated aircraft. Meanwhile, deck crews, distinguishable by different colored vests for identification, finalize preparations for the mission launch. The pilot conducts a thorough walk-around check of the aircraft before both pilot and radar officer embark on the Phantom. The launch weight is indicated for the catapult officer's attention. In the fleet defense role, the pilot assumes control of the aircraft and oversees combat operations, while the radar intercept officer manages radar operations and initiates early interception procedures. Subsequently, both cockpit canopies are sealed shut, and the deck crew raises the catapult bridle in readiness for launch. The flight deck director meticulously guides each aircraft into position over its assigned catapult, carefully maneuvering it onto the shuttle over the wheel section of the catapult. Subsequently, the bridle is securely attached, and any slack in the bridle is eliminated by nudging the catapult shuttle forward slightly. Simultaneously, the companion Phantom on the second catapult undergoes identical preparation. With cockpit checks also finalized, the deck director signals the pilot to advance the engines to takeoff power. Finally, the director signals the launch, and the Phantom is hurled down the catapult run and over the bow of the carrier at a speed of 185 miles per hour. As the first pair embarks on their combat air patrol, another duo of Phantoms taxis towards the launch area. Upon reaching the designated spot, deflectors are raised to redirect exhaust gases away from the flight deck. Simultaneously, the shuttle is repositioned, allowing the next Phantom slated for that catapult to align its nose wheel unit over the shuttle and position itself in line with the catapult while the deck crew raises the bridle. This launch sequence continues with up to 4 aircraft dispatched almost simultaneously. Additional aircraft are brought up via the deck edge elevators. Enabling launches to proceed, including instances of triple dispatchers. Equipped with a 2-person crew, potent radar, and an arsenal comprising Sparrow medium-range and Sidewinder short-range missiles, the Phantom was heralded as the world's first fighter with independent search and destroy capability, free from ground control, and proved invaluable for the US Navy in the 1960s. Its service capabilities were swiftly showcased through a series of world records. In December 1959, the Phantom achieved a zoom climb-to-altitude record of 98,556 feet. In September 1960, it secured 2 closed-circuit records at speeds of 1,217 and 1,390 miles per hour. Less than a year later, in August 1961, it established a low-altitude speed record of 903 miles per hour, followed shortly thereafter in November by an absolute world speed record of 1,606 miles per hour. Undoubtedly, one of the most remarkable early achievements took place in May 1961, commemorating the 50th anniversary of naval aviation. 5 prototype Phantoms embarked on a journey from west to east across the United States, completing the transcontinental flight in a mere 2 hours and 47 minutes, smashing previous records. Upon concluding their patrol, the Phantoms returned to the carrier for landing. Approaching at 150 miles per hour, each aircraft undergoes visual inspection to verify the lowering of landing gear and flaps. They're then guided down by the landing signal officer once the assistant confirms a clear deck.
Okay on 3. Science ramp on 5.
As the pilot aligns for approach, guidance is provided by an amber light known as the meatball, situated on the right side of the flight deck. The pilot keeps this lined up with the row of green lights to ensure that he is in the groove, the correct glide slope to fly the aircraft onto the deck and catch the wire. Different light angle approach settings are configured for each type of aircraft aboard. Following each landing, the wire disengages from the arrestor hook and returns to its position as the landed aircraft taxis clear, facilitating the prompt arrival of the next aircraft. Subsequently, the landed aircraft are lowered to the hangar deck via the 4 deck edge elevators to initiate the maintenance cycle before their next mission. Each of the 4 Forrestal-class ships boasts approximately 3.5 acres of maintenance area below the flight deck, though this capacity accommodates only half of the carrier's 90 aircraft at any given time. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, both the F-4B and the upgraded, more potent F-4J versions of the Phantom served as the backbone of the US Navy's air defense. Extending outward to a radius of 400 miles from the carrier, the Phantom maintained unrivaled effectiveness in combat air patrol until the introduction of the Grumman F-14 Tomcat. During the Vietnam War, US Navy Phantoms occasionally operated as attack aircraft from land bases while detached from their parent carriers. These F-4J aircraft, derived from the original F-4B, featured more powerful engines, drooping ailerons to complement the flaps, slotted and hence more efficient tailplanes, and an enhanced combination of AWG-10 fire control radar and AJB-7 bombing system for improved air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities. The pilot assumes the primary responsibility of flying the aircraft, remaining fully engaged in ensuring all systems are functioning optimally and monitoring fuel levels while maintaining a vigilant visual scan of the sky for potential threats that may have eluded radar detection. In the rear seat, the radar intercept officer employs increasingly sophisticated equipment to monitor the tactical situation and provides ongoing updates to the pilot. The Phantom earned its stripes in Vietnam and remained one of the few US combat aircraft in that theater never to be withdrawn. Throughout the conflict, it consistently demonstrated its ability to meet the diverse demands placed upon it and garnered deep admiration from its crews. However, the Phantom wasn't without its shortcomings, particularly in its early iterations. One notable flaw was its smoky power plant, which could inadvertently reveal the aircraft's position to adversaries. Another significant operator of the Phantom in Vietnam was the US Marine Corps, with a key Marine aviation unit, Aircraft Group 13, stationed at Chile in 1968. Aircraft were stored in blast-proof revetments between missions to mitigate the impact of communist rocket and mortar attacks on airfields and to impede potential close assaults by Viet Cong sappers. Prior to boarding the Phantom, the crew conducts a thorough walk-around check to ensure the aircraft exhibits no visible defects. They inspect the underwing pods to confirm full attachment, complete loading, and proper electrical connection, as well as to ensure the safe handling of the 2.75-inch rockets. Examination of the main landing gear wheel well is conducted to detect any signs of hydraulic or fuel leaks. A brief inspection confirms that the Mach 4 20mm cannon pod is loaded with ammunition and free of apparent issues. The bomb load is finalized with triplets of retarded high-explosive bombs loaded onto the wing pylons by the ordnance crew, utilizing a specialized jack-up bomb trolley. Safety pins are inserted to secure the bombs before the trolley is removed. And safety wires are affixed to each bomb to prevent arming until after release. As it falls, the wire breaks, thus freeing the nose-mounted propeller to turn the requisite number of times and so arm the weapon. The two crew members undertake the standard walk-around check before boarding the aircraft. With assistance from the ground crew, they strap in and then don their bone dome helmets and flame-resistant gloves. The next task involves conducting a cockpit check with the aid of a specialized checklist. All moving surfaces undergo a final visual inspection and testing as the ground crew remove flagged pins and safeties, which are then prominently displayed to the pilot. Loaded with 12 bombs and a centerline drop tank, the F-4B of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 115 taxis out for takeoff, accompanied by other Phantoms slated for the mission joining up on the runway. Before receiving clearance for takeoff, the crew verifies that the outer wings are securely locked down, then proceeds to embark on another tactical sortie in support of Marine Corps ground forces. As the scope of US operations in Vietnam expanded steadily during the later 1960s, there was a corresponding increase in the expansion and enhancement of bases utilized by aircraft like the Phantom, which necessitated fully paved runways. Marines are depicted laying a temporary extension to a paved runway in the image. Ground operations necessitated support around the clock and in all weather conditions, highlighting the crucial role played by Marine Aviation Phantom squadrons in facilitating the success of Marine Corps ground forces in Vietnam. Phantom pilots took pride in their ability to deliver a wide array of ordnance with precision, particularly in close proximity to friendly forces' forward positions, a capability that proved pivotal in crisis situations. The ability to rapidly respond allowed constant pressure to be applied on the enemy, whose precise location was communicated via radio relay by ground forces or a forward air controller. Waves of aircraft ensured sustained air pressure on hostile ground forces and enabled the deployment of various types of ordnance tailored to the circumstances of each tactical scenario. The US Air Force emerged as a major operator of the Phantom in Vietnam, commencing with the F-4C land-based variant of the F-4B, followed by the modestly improved F-4D featuring enhanced ground attack capabilities. Despite susceptibility to communist guerrilla attacks, centralized fueling systems like the one at Cam Ranh Bay offered tactical advantages, prompting their utilization in Vietnam. The Phantom's high fuel consumption posed challenges for holding quick reaction units on the runway, but often circumstances demanded it to swiftly deploy maximum aerial firepower against communist forces. However, this practice exposed crews to heat fatigue under the scorching tropical sun while waiting fully manned and armed on standby. Despite these concerns, the paramount consideration remained the speed of reaction, ensuring Phantoms could be scrambled promptly when needed. After the standard preparation and takeoff, sometimes with reduced fuel to allow the maximum possible war load to be uplifted, the Air Force's Phantoms often linked up with a Boeing KC-135 tanker to top up their tanks and thus increase combat radius with a war load of up to 16,000 pounds of external stores. Here, the boomer aboard the tanker aircraft guides the boom into the Phantom's dorsal receptacle for fuel transfer. Renowned as the quintessential attack aircraft in Vietnam, the Phantom offered an impressive combination of payload capacity and range, coupled with robust airframe strength and advanced avionics, ensuring precise targeting with remarkable accuracy. This footage, captured during an attack, vividly demonstrates the Phantom's capability to engage heavily defended targets in North Vietnam as effectively as less fortified targets of opportunity in the war-ridden terrain of South Vietnam. Targets outside of South Vietnam included critical communication networks, power plants, and strategic stockpiles, all heavily guarded by anti-aircraft artillery and missiles. Even in adverse weather conditions, Phantoms demonstrated their ability to penetrate defences and deliver their payloads. The Vietnam War saw the deployment of the entire spectrum of tactical weapons by the USAF, encompassing various types of freefall and retarded high-explosive bombs. Retarded bombs were specifically designed to allow attacking aircraft to drop them accurately at low altitudes to maximize the force of the explosion. In coordinated operations, Phantoms would operate in tight formations at medium altitudes, with all aircraft releasing their bombs upon the leader's command to achieve maximum concentration of ordnance. Napalm emerged as a particularly vital weapon in the US tactical arsenal during the Vietnam War. While the initial F-4C proved effective, it underwent development into the F-4D with enhancements such as the APQ-109A radar replacing the APQ-100 and the ASG-22 sight. However, both models lacked an internal gun, leading to the frequent use of cannon pods in both air-to-air and air-to-surface roles. Pictured here is an SUU-16A pod loaded with 1,200 rounds of 20mm ammunition. The pod incorporates an external ram turbine to power the cannon, restricting the aircraft to speeds below 400 miles per hour during the firing pass. Thus, its use was confined mainly to the air-to-ground role, as demonstrated in these sequences of typical ground attack passes. The SUU-16A and the SUU-23A self-powered versions, designed for high-speed air-to-air engagements, served as solutions, albeit not ideal ones, to the Phantom's lack of an internal gun. Additionally, the Phantom operated with air-to-surface missiles, like the 12,000-yard range Bullpup. As previously mentioned, its primary air-to-air armament consisted of the medium-range Sparrow and short-range Sidewinder missiles. Although air combat was infrequent during the Vietnam War, encounters with MiG fighters did occur, often resulting in successful engagements, such as the one depicted here with a Sparrow missile, or through cannon fire, as captured in classic camera gun footage. The definitive USAF version, the F-4E, introduced an M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon in the lower nose, along with the smaller diameter APQ-120 radar, uprated engines, a slotted tailplane, and maneuvering slats on the outer wing panels. Similar to earlier Phantom variants, provision was made for podded electronic countermeasures like the jammer pod, seen here, carried in the port-forward Sparrow missile recess. The Phantom quickly garnered significant export orders and emerged as the Western world's most vital tactical fighter. The Phantom saw service with 11 overseas operators, including Australia, Greece, West Germany, Turkey, South Korea, Japan, Iran, Egypt, Israel, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Despite not being the third largest purchaser of Phantom aircraft in terms of numbers, the UK pursued a significantly modified variant derived from the US Navy's F-4J. Designated as the F-4K for the Royal Navy and the F-4M for the RAF, this variant featured two Rolls-Royce Spey afterburning turbofans. This necessitated substantial revisions to the fuselage, although the additional drag resulting from these modifications offset the advantages of the more powerful and fuel-efficient power plant. The naval variant, known as the Phantom FG Mark I, boasted the AWG-11 fire control radar and incorporated various British features. Its armament included the Sparrow missile and the 2-inch rocket, the latter housed in multiple pods mounted under the wings. The FG Mark I remained in service with the Fleet Air Arm until the Royal Navy was forced to phase out its fixed-wing carrier strength in the mid-1970s. Following the allocation of survivors from the Fleet Air Arm's 52 aircraft, the Royal Air Force operated the Phantom FRG Mark II, equipped with the AWG-12 fire control radar and a British navigation attack system. Peacetime ground attack training typically involved rockets, cannon pods, and practice bombs, as depicted in the accompanying sequence.
About 5 degrees coming on the attack heading now. Contact the target, master arms going on, and the camera's going on. Going right a bit. Firing now, and pulling. Carrying down with now for approach landing.
Roger, Red Leader, joint.
Gears down. On speed.
The 150 British Phantoms primarily serve in air defence roles over the UK, with a secondary responsibility for fighter ground attack missions. Number 41 Squadron exemplifies one of the 7 British Phantom squadrons, with 2 squadrons flying ex-naval FG Mark I variants and a 3rd squadron operating ex-US Navy F-4Js. The latter was necessitated by the RAF's increased commitment in the South Atlantic following the Falklands War of 1982. Modern developments have highlighted alternative roles for the Phantom, such as reconnaissance and defence suppression. One of the most significant developments has been the creation of the F-4ES, high-altitude photo reconnaissance variant of the F-4E, exclusively utilised by Israel. This variant features a completely modified nose section to accommodate special HIA C1 oblique photo equipment, enabling the high-altitude aircraft to surveil deep into enemy territory while remaining in the relative safety of friendly airspace. Israel is also undertaking upgrades to its fighter models. Additionally, countries like Japan, South Korea and West Germany envision a future for their fighters, following extensive upgrades by their respective aircraft industries. Throughout its service history, the Phantom has demonstrated remarkable adaptability across a wide range of roles, utilizing various weapon types on its 5 hardpoints. Some of the most important are illustrated in the next few sequences. Unguided rockets have played a particularly significant role in area ground attacks. Among the most commonly utilized types are the 2.75-inch rockets, with the 5-inch variants being less frequently employed. These rockets are fired from launchers of various sizes and are effective against soft battlefield targets such as troop concentrations, unarmored vehicles and artillery positions. In the air-to-air role, the short-range infrared-guided Sidewinder has proven more successful than the medium-range Sparrow. The Sidewinder locks onto the heat emitted by the target, providing reliable targeting compared to the Sparrow, which homes in on radar reflections bouncing off the target. The Phantom can carry up to 4 Sparrow missiles under the fuselage and 2 or 4 Sidewinders on underwing hardpoints, offering maximum flexibility in air-to-air engagements. In the depicted sequence, a Convair F-102 Delta Dagger pilotless drone serves as the target. A late-model Sidewinder successfully hits the drone's tailpipe, demonstrating the effectiveness of the weapon. Following the successful hit, the drone experiences successive breakup as it tumbles out of control. Both saturation and precision bombing have been conducted against point and area targets, utilizing a wide range of US bomb types, including highly effective high-blast demolition types. Cannon pods have also proven highly successful in the air-to-ground role, with 20mm pods being more common, although 30mm pods can also be carried. Multiple pods have demonstrated devastating effectiveness in air-to-surface operations. As the most important type in US Navy and US Air Force service during the 1960s and early 1970s, the Phantom was utilized by aerobatic display teams of each service. The Navy's team, the Blue Angels, operated the F-4J until the rising fuel prices necessitated a change to the McDonnell Douglas A-4F Skyhawk in 1974. Similarly, the Air Force's team, the Thunderbirds, flew the F-4E until transitioning to a smaller and more economical type. In this instance, the Northrop T-38A Talon. The Phantom stands as the Western world's most widely built and extensively utilised combat aircraft since World War II, making its production milestones notable achievements in aviation history. The 1000th Phantom, an F-4B for the US Navy, was delivered on July 7, 1965. 2 years later, the 2000th Phantom, an F-4D for the Air Force, followed on February 21, 1967. Just 17 months later, on August 28, 1968, the 3000th Phantom, an F-4J, was produced for the US Navy. An F-4E for the Air Force became the 4000th Phantom on February 1, 1971. Finally, on May 24, 1978, the 5000th Phantom, an F-4E, was delivered to the Turkish Air Force. Although the Phantom is no longer in production, it remains an effective warplane. A classic fighter isn't just one that performs well under ideal conditions, it's one that accomplishes missions beyond its original design. The success of the Phantom was a result of the courage and skill of its crews, supported by an aircraft that was capable and versatile enough to adapt to various missions. The F-4 Phantom was neither pretty nor elegant, but it did its job when so many other aircraft in history could not. That's what counts.
Nicknamed the Thud for its powerful punch, this wasn't just another fighter. We're talking a supersonic, nuclear-capable fighter-bomber. This beast wasn't just fast, it was supersonic. Designed as a nuclear strike fighter, the Thud became the workhorse of the Vietnam War. Think massive bomb loads, screaming low-level runs, and the guts to take on anything the enemy threw at it. From rolling thunder to daring rescue missions, the F-105 was there. Get ready to meet a true legend of the skies, a jet that earned its stripes the hard way. The Republic F-105 Thunderchief.
This is an F-105G, the wild Weasel variant of the Thunderchief, the final evolution of a plane that, upon its debut, was the largest single-engine, single-seat fighter ever built. The F-105 was an incredibly powerful weapon, earning the nickname One-Man Air Force in the skies over Vietnam. Its designer, Alexander Kartveli, was Republic's chief designer and well-versed in large fighter aircraft. Having previously developed the P-47 Thunderbolt in World War II, the biggest single-engine fighter of its time. Produced in vast numbers, the P-47 proved to be a rugged workhorse, excelling not only as an air superiority and escort fighter, but also as a fighter-bomber in tactical support missions. Advanced Project 63, the design studies that led to the F-105, began in 1951 during the height of the Korean War, initially as a privately funded modernization of Republic's F-84. The F-84 had been conceived as a jet-powered Thunderbolt for escort and tactical fighter-bomber roles. In Korea, it struggled against the MiG-15 in escort missions but performed effectively in ground attack. Its straight-wing design was highly conventional, though later versions featured swept wings, better suited for the jet's speed potential. However, with lessons from Korea and the relentless pace of technological advancement pushing them forward, the design team soon realized they were creating an entirely new aircraft. As Republic's engineers embarked on their project, their counterparts at North American had just secured U.S. Air Force backing for the F-100 Super Sabre, the first in the Century series of fighters, designed to fulfill various roles as the Air Force transitioned to supersonic flight. Initially a refinement of the successful F-86 Sabre, the F-100 was first classified as an air superiority fighter, though later versions incorporated fighter-bomber capabilities. With a top speed of 860 miles per hour, the Hun became the U.S. Air Force's first supersonic fighter and proved invaluable in Vietnam, particularly in tactical support missions. Next in line was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. Developed as a penetration and escort fighter, the rapid pace of aviation advancements is evident in the fact that, although ordered just a year after the F-100, the F-101 reached a top speed of 1,100 miles per hour. Like its predecessor, later models gained tactical versatility, and it was widely used in Vietnam, most notably for photo reconnaissance. The third Century series fighter was General Dynamics F-102 Delta Dagger, an all-weather interceptor that began development in 1950. Capable of 820 miles per hour, it achieved only moderate success but naturally evolved into the F-106, which boasted a top speed of 1,500 miles per hour. Lockheed's F-104 Starfighter, ordered in March 1953, prioritized flight performance above all else as an air superiority fighter. Essentially a manned missile, the 1,400 mile per hour F-104 had a turbulent service history but displayed remarkable longevity as a tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft. At Republic, Kartvelli's team, working on Advanced Project 63, explored 108 design configurations before settling on a single-engine, single-seat tactical fighter bomber capable of carrying nuclear weapons in an internal bomb bay. This aircraft, the F-105A, received Air Force approval in September 1952, initially intended for mass production, though only 2 were ultimately built. Completing the Century series, the F-105 was the first purpose-built tactical strike aircraft ordered for the U.S. Air Force. The need for such an aircraft arose from a mix of Korean battlefield experience, geopolitical shifts, and competition between the U.S. Air Force's strategic and tactical air commands. For TAC, the F-105 not only expanded their conventional mission scope, but also granted them the ability to deliver nuclear weapons over long distances, elevating their prestige to rival that of Strategic Command. The Tactical Air Command's backing of the F-105 proved crucial as the aircraft navigated its challenging early years. With aviation technology undergoing a complete transformation to meet the demands of supersonic flight, the F-105 faced significant developmental hurdles. What set the massive fighter apart, however, was its vast internal capacity. The atomic bombs it carried, more akin to barrels than traditional weapons, gave it an unmatched level of firepower. For the F-105A, advances in understanding transonic drag, along with certain inherent flaws, led to the design being quickly outdated. It took its first flight more than 3 years after U.S. Air Force approval, by which time its internal systems had been completely overhauled. By then, production of its successor was already in progress. The third F-105 built became the first B model. Seen here on May 26, 1956, it taxis to its takeoff point for its maiden flight. This was the first F-105 to receive an engine powerful enough to match its size, alongside major external modifications. Chief among them was area ruling, which had solved the F-102's drag and turbulence issues. This replaced the A model's straight fuselage with a distinctive wasp waist over the wings. A large four-pedaled air brake now dominated the once sleek engine exhaust, and modifications to the air intakes gave the Thunderchief its signature nostrils. A larger tail area enhanced stability. These and other modifications resulted in an aircraft capable of reaching twice the speed of sound. Fittingly, its maiden flight was plagued by near-disastrous issues. Planned as a brief circuit, the flight took a dangerous turn when the nosewheel failed to deploy. Repeated attempts to raise and lower the landing gear had no effect. The nosewheel remained stuck. Rather than abandon the aircraft, the decision was made to attempt a belly landing. The test pilot brought the plane down in a long, hazardous skid across the salt flats. As the aircraft finally came to rest, emergency crews rushed in through the clearing dust. The crash was more than just a major embarrassment for a program already criticized as costly and riddled with technical issues. However, it could still be argued that each problem led to improvements that enhanced the aircraft's overall capability. Even as a test platform, the F-105 was revolutionizing not just aviation science, but the future of tactical aircraft. The cause of the crash was quickly traced to the new air intake controls, which, at high thrust settings, jammed the nosewheel in place, a relatively simple issue to fix. One other thing the crash revealed was a trait that those who flew the Thunderchief in combat would come to respect: its durability. The aircraft was lifted, its landing gear was extended, and the prototype was towed away for repairs. Once built, it rejoined the test program as engineers worked to integrate its complex systems and resolve technical issues. They were grappling with forces and concepts that were only just within their control, solving problems as they emerged. It's hard to imagine any other way these theoretical and practical challenges could have been managed amid the rapid pace of technological advancement. As the first aircraft designed for both air-to-air combat and semi-automated air-to-ground weapons delivery, the F-105 depended on avionics systems far beyond anything previously developed. Among its advanced capabilities were radar systems for air search, contour mapping, terrain following, and automatic tracking of both air and ground targets, even in zero visibility conditions. Throughout its service life, The F-105 continuously received upgrades and new technologies, but from the start, it was a fighter far ahead of its time. The rebuilt aircraft was assigned to the spin testing program, with a spin recovery parachute installed on its tail. This required moving a panel to make space for the chute and eliminating the air brake to ensure an unobstructed deployment if needed. Tests confirmed that the parachute functioned properly. The purpose of spin testing is to verify that an aircraft can recover from a spin and return to stable flight, essentially to ensure that lost control can be regained. Naturally, the first step in such a test is to deliberately lose control of the plane. The test pilot must then sit tight as the aircraft tumbles through the air for a set period before attempting recovery. This is not a job for the faint of heart. Ultimately, the emergency parachute was never required, as the aircraft exhibited unnatural tendency to level out after each revolution, allowing pilots to regain control with relative ease. However, the airframe still needed rigorous testing, so the trials continued. A total of 47 times, pilots released control and watched as the horizon spun away in a dizzying plunge. If you look closely, you'll notice a burst of flame erupting from the aircraft's tail as the engine stalls. Although flight tests progressed well, technical issues persisted, with both the engine and avionics remaining unreliable. This uncertainty in performance was mirrored by broader doubts about the aircraft's future. Initial plans for large-scale production had dwindled to an order of 37, before being canceled entirely in December 1953. A new order in February 1954 called for 15 aircraft, but by September, this had been reduced to 3, only to be increased to 6 the following month. Amid this instability, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already undergone multiple revisions before being officially published in December 1954. By April 1955, they had been altered 3 more times. Despite the project's uncertain future, the test teams continued their work, pushing forward with evaluations. The F-105's already impressive range was further extended with the addition of external fuel tanks, which also required testing to assess their impact on the aircraft and evaluate their own performance. Throughout 1957, testing continued, with the prototype logging extensive flight hours over the desert as the aircraft underwent multiple modifications. The pre-service evaluations, initially scheduled for completion in November 1959, ultimately extended until March 1960. One specification added in 1954 required the F-105 to be capable of in-flight refueling, a relatively new innovation that was already in widespread use. However, for an aircraft like the F-105, this presented a significant challenge. Slowing to match the tanker's speed left the pilot with insufficient airflow over the wings to maintain lift. The top speed of the tanker and the minimum speed of the F-105 were nearly identical, making the fighter difficult to control, especially in the wake turbulence of the larger aircraft, often leading to stalls. Attempts to mitigate the issue by equipping tankers with additional jet engines, as seen here with a modified B-29, provided little improvement. The problem affected all supersonic fighters until jet-powered tankers eventually increased refueling speeds to safer levels. The tests confirmed the challenges faced by the fighter pilot. While some successful couplings were made, the system proved largely impractical, not because of any fault in the F-105, but due to the limitations of the tankers. Moving the drogue from the tail to the wingtip reduced exposure to the larger plane's turbulence, offering some improvement, but the risk of stalling persisted. The long drogue hose in use didn't help ease the process, as it required the fighter pilot to maneuver into position. It wasn't until this method was replaced by a system where the fighter simply maintained its position while the tanker operator directed the connection that refueling became truly practical. The F-105 was equipped with two types of refueling connectors, both of which would see extensive use during the Thunderchief's service. By late 1954, Republic must have been uncertain about the future of the F-105, with their anxiety only slightly alleviated by the bittersweet news they received in February 1955. The order was increased back to 15, with the possibility of fulfilling the rest of the original 34 only if funds became available in the next fiscal year. Adding to the uncertainty was the unsettling condition that the F-105 would have to compete in a fly-off against North American's F-107, an upgraded, high-powered variant of the Super Sabre. The F-107 has often been described as the best fighter never purchased by the U.S. Air Force, and it was undeniably a formidable aircraft. With the same engine as the Thunderchief, it was a highly advanced and powerful design, offering similar performance. However, in the crucial areas of stores carriage and delivery, it lagged behind the F-105, making the competition seem somewhat inconsequential. Had the F-107 been compared to nearly any other aircraft of the time, it might have outperformed it. Yet the F-105 was a unique opponent, and its performance was gradually silencing doubts about its value. The Thunderchief's specifications had undergone continuous revisions, expanding its system's capabilities. Ongoing electronic upgrades ensured that the aircraft remained at the cutting edge of performance throughout its development and operational life. The numerous design changes meant that the first 15 F-105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. In the end, there would be 19. Throughout the testing program, these revisions resulted in frequent extensions of the trials. Normal flight testing was completed with minimal issues, as the airframe performed well and exhibited excellent flight characteristics. However, delays were caused by the development of the plane's electronics, as their performance was gradually elevated to meet their intended specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can now recognize the exceptional aircraft that was taking shape. Yet at the time there was significant skepticism, and many raised eyebrows regarding the plane's future. On May 28, 1958, 3 years later than initially planned, the U.S. Air Force received its first operational F-105. Fittingly, it became the only one of its subtype. Air Force fighter pilots, initially disappointed to discover their new aircraft was essentially a large bomber, had mockingly dubbed it the Lead Sled, Thunder Thud, or simply Thud. However, once they got their hands on the plane, their opinion quickly changed. The nickname stuck, but no longer with any negative connotation. The large aircraft became universally loved by its pilots. Not only did it handle and perform like a fighter, but it also packed an impressive punch. When fully loaded, the F-105 could carry up to 14,000 pounds of various external stores, including bombs, rockets, rocket pods, cannon pods, electronic countermeasure packs, air-to-surface missiles, and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. But perhaps most importantly, the Thunderchief featured a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted seamlessly into the aircraft. To ensure the bomb was ejected accurately and clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down using a pneumatic rack. The rack was sturdy enough to serve as a jack for loading the bomb bay when a bomb trolley wasn't available. However, during wartime operations, the Thuds rarely carried bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was used for additional fuel storage. The outer wings had provisions for 2 stores pylons, which could carry a mix of weaponry and fuel, or be removed to make way for specialized racks, like this one for the Sidewinder missile. The standard armament across all Thunderchief's variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at an impressive 6,000 rounds per minute, emptying its 1,029 round capacity in under 11 seconds. Deliveries to the Air Force continued, with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron becoming the first unit fully equipped with the new fighter, marking the occasion by setting a world speed record. In 1961, the Thunderchiefs were deployed overseas to bases in Germany. In the summer of 1964, the Thuds saw action for the first time, and soon after they were repainted with new camouflage as they were sent in greater numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From these bases, the F-105s launched campaigns that would cement their place in history. For the Thunderchief, Vietnam proved to be the right place at the right time. Despite ongoing reliability issues throughout its service life, culminating in a grounding as late as 1962, the Thud's reputation was far from secure. While these problems were eventually addressed, a series of minor defects and accidents persisted right up until their missions in Vietnam. However, the Thuds in Vietnam quickly earned a very different reputation for being reliable and tough aircraft. They also gained a fearsome status as weapons of war. The significance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam is reflected in the numbers. In the first 5 years of the U.S. Air Force's involvement, the Thuds flew an astonishing 75% of all attack missions. If the skies over Vietnam were filled with bombs, it was the Thuds that put them there. Beginning in March 1965, airstrikes on North Vietnam increased, with most raids focused on communication targets. These missions relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air, loaded with bombs, and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. With their heavy loads and the need to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam, rather than cruising to and from their targets, their range was significantly reduced. Even with full tanks, these journeys left little margin for error. Once fueled, the Thuds flew into hostile airspace. At the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese had limited air defenses, and the early raids were relatively quiet. However, this quickly changed as supplies of anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters increased, and the raids were soon flown into the heart of one of the most formidable air defense systems ever encountered in warfare. The F-105s pounded enemy bridges, roads, track parks, and military bases, while the Vietnamese responded with powerful defenses. Although the loss rate on individual raids wasn't critical, the process of slow attrition began, and by the end of the conflict, the Thunderchiefs had taken heavy losses. Out of 833 F-105s built, 400 would meet their end in Vietnam. Production of the F-105s was completed in December 1964, with only 78 B models built. The majority, 610, were F-105Ds. The F-105D had an extended nose to accommodate updated all-weather navigation systems, making it externally quite different from the F-105B. The other 143 were the twin-seat F model. Although it had always been expected that a twin-seat version of the F-105 would be developed, 2 earlier proposals for such a version had been dropped. The F models served as the foundation for the later development of the final variant, the F-105G, or Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the F-105D. The single-seat Ds were abundant at the bases, where war work continued 24 hours a day. After each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the plane's performance and hand it over for servicing. The service record of the F-105s in Vietnam was exemplary. On any given day, over 90% of the Thuds were ready for work, a figure that was higher than the overall average in the U.S. Air Force. Considering the complexity of the aircraft, the workload, and the relative scarcity of these big planes, this performance was truly outstanding. To keep them flying, facilities for complete maintenance were established at the bases, with specialist teams constantly available to fly in for specific issues. Ground crews at the bases carried out normal turnaround routines, refueling, filling the tail's water tank for the afterburner, rearming the aircraft, and other servicing between missions, quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. Though the fuselage had little spare room, the layout was sufficiently organized to ensure that servicing the aircraft was relatively straightforward. The bases where the F-105s operated were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief, parked on a vast expanse of hard stand, could be serviced with relative ease. For each mission, the wing point combinations were selected and adjusted, and the plane was armed in a smooth, practiced routine. A large portion of the bombs dropped in Vietnam were iron bombs from the Second World War. Sadly, these bombs were a product of a design philosophy and era that should have been long outdated. Modern smart bombs didn't make their appearance in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the final phases of the conflict. As a result, F-105 missions often involved delivering hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, sometimes unstable in trajectory, and frequently unreliable in its effects. But with these bombs, the Thuds hammered the North and, in most instances, successfully destroyed their allocated targets. Throughout the night, the bases were a hive of activity as the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes continued. What made the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage needing repairs. Thuds sustained strikes from surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG cannons, yet they survived. In one instance, this aircraft was actually hit by a Sidewinder missile. Each morning, the one-man Air Force was ready, prepared for the next mission. In March 1965, the U.S. Air Force launched the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of Thunder in the name was fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was almost entirely the domain of the Thunderchief. The expanded air war in the North had 3 objectives. First, to reduce the infiltration into the South. Second, to pressure the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the Southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, with targets progressively further over the border. And the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges, railways, and roads exacted a great cost on the communists, significantly hampering their war effort. However, although the Hanoi leadership was at times shaken, they did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, while the Vietnamese, armed with everything the Russians and Chinese could provide, tried to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was very little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets, such as docks and storage facilities, were located within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the two major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the U.S. consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting in the South. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of surface-to-air missiles that rose at them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles. In tangles with MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such a reserve of power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could, in most cases, simply accelerate away from them. Furthermore, the Thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and mixing it up in combat. 28 MiG-17s were downed by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied aircraft at every level, from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes, packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the MiG squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored, and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, ensured that for large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were part of a chain of command that stretched back from Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii, all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the Thuds, setting off daily with their loads. Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105 carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to deny the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, with others soon to follow. The most critical fatigue concern was the strain on the engines. The missions the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly running at full power, with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, the normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours, and teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them, and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 380th Squadron was flying a Thunderchief with 3,000 hours under its belt, having gone out on 500 missions, received flak damage on several occasions, and been involved in a mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of their work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been heavily influenced by the story of the Thud, and which reflected many of the lessons learned in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to in order to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the two-seater surface-to-air missile-suppressing Wild Weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support, and electronic countermeasures systems. The Thuds were still workhorses, right through to the devastating Linebacker 1 and 2 operations, which finally brought the North to a negotiating position that allowed the U.S. to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home, and the results were devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing hauls, with trucks bumper to bumper illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of the bombing. With thuds overhead, the trucks became far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thud saw hundreds of pilots through their tours and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job, and grateful to have survived. However, many of them were to miss their big machines, and the sensation of howling through the air in a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Pirwati began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the U.S. Air Force after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There weren't too many of them around, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve flight of an F-105 was on the 25th of May, 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the F-105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them considered their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was gotten right so well in one package. There were never very many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. But if the words great plane can be ascribed to any plane, then they can certainly be ascribed to the F-105 Thunderchief, the Thud.
The McDonnell F-101 Voodoo was a supersonic jet fighter which served in the United States Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force. The origins of the F-101 actually had little to do with the jobs for which it was used over its long career with the U.S. Air Force, Air National Guard, and Canadian Armed Forces. Neither tactical reconnaissance nor all-weather interception had been a factor in early 1946 when the newly formed Strategic Air Command solicited proposals for a jet-propelled strategic penetration fighter. SAC's chief criteria at the time had been sufficient range to accompany its bombers. Boeing B-29s and the soon-to-fly Convair B-36s all the way to their targets, and adequate speed and firepower to deal with enemy interceptors. 4 swept-wing designs were ultimately approved for prototype development: the McDonnell XF-88 Voodoo, Lockheed XF-90, Republic XF-91 Thunderscepter, and North American YF-93A, a development of the F-86. All of which flew between 1948 and 1950. After being awarded a contract on February 14, 1947, McDonnell built 2 prototypes, designated the XF-88 Voodoo. The first prototype, serial number 46-6525, powered by 2 Westinghouse XJ34-WE-13 turbojets, flew from Mach on 20th of October 1948. Preliminary testing revealed that while handling and range were adequate, the top speed was a disappointing 641 miles an hour at sea level. After fitting McDonnell Design's afterburners to the second prototype, thrust was increased to 3,600 pounds with corresponding performance increases in top speed, initial rate of climb, and reduced takeoff distance. Fuel consumption was greatly increased by the use of afterburners. However, reducing a range. When a fly-off was held in the summer of 1950, McDonnell's XF-88A, an improvement over its 1948 prototype, emerged as the winner of the penetration fighter competition against the Lockheed XF-90 and North American YF-93. McDonnell's success was momentary. However, the Air Force, motivated by unexpected budget cuts, abruptly canceled the XF-88A program and made the decision to use the Republic F-84E Thunderjets as interim bomber escorts. Combat experience in Korea soon revealed that the straight-wing F-84s were not suited for air-to-air role, and the North American F-86 Sabre jet clearly lacked the range to escort bombers to long-range targets. Something better was needed, so SAC, determined to protect its emerging fleet of B-36s, issued new requirements for a long-range fighter in January 1951. This time, adding specifications for parallel development of photo reconnaissance versions of the new type. Lockheed, North American, Republic, and McDonnell all submitted new proposals, joined by a bid from Northrop for a long-range version of its F-89 Scorpion. In May 1951, the Air Force announced that McDonnell's entry, basically a scaled-up XF-88A upgraded with more powerful Allison J-35A-23 engines, was the winning bidder. But before construction was authorized, the Air Force specified major changes aimed at improving overall range and performance, the most significant being the substitution of Pratt & Whitney J57P-13 power plants, which required enlarging and lengthening the fuselage to carry more fuel and house bigger engines, plus extensively revising the air intakes and related engine ducting. The greater dimensions of the J57 engines required modifications to the engine bays, and modification to their intakes to allow larger amounts of airflow into the engine. The new intakes were also designed to be more efficient at higher Mach numbers. In order to increase aerodynamic efficiency, reduce structural weight, and alleviate pitch-up phenomena recently identified in flight testing of the Douglas D-55-82 Skyrocket, an aircraft with control surface configuration similar to the XF-88, the horizontal tail was relocated to the top of the vertical stabilizer, giving the F-101 its signature T-tail. When the McDonnell team, led by Edward M. Flesch, completed the final design in late 1951, the Voodoo had grown 13 feet longer and weighed twice as much as its XF-88 predecessor. The F-88 was redesignated the F-101 Voodoo in November of 1951. The F-101A would be, at the time, the largest single-seat fighter ever built, 67 feet, 5 inches long, and weighing over 48,000 pounds fully loaded. Although the wing had been slightly enlarged by increasing the chord of the inboard half of each panel, total area was still relatively small, 368 square feet, producing prodigious loading of 135.9 pounds per square foot, the highest of the Century series in original configuration. Internal fuel capacity increased from 734 to 2,341 gallons, augmented by two 450-gallon external drop tanks. Provisions were also made for an in-flight refueling, either via flying boom or probe and drogue systems to extend the plane's combat radius even further. An APS-54 search radar provided all-weather capability, and heavy firepower came from four 20mm cannons, 3 Hughes GAR-1 Falcon radar homing missiles, and up to 12 unguided rockets. Before the final design was fixed, the Air Force expanded the fighter's potential mission uses by adding the capability to carry a nuclear weapon on an external rack. In late 1952, the mission of the F-101 was changed from penetration fighter to strategic fighter, which entailed equal emphasis on both the bomber escort mission and on nuclear weapons delivery. The new Voodoo mock-up with the reconfigured inlets, tail surfaces, landing gear, and dummy nuclear weapon was inspected by Air Force officials in March 1953. The design was approved. An initial order for 29 F-101As was placed on May 28, 1953. No prototypes had been required, as the F-101 was considered a simple development of the XF-88, with the Cook-Craig production policy, in which initial low-rate production would be used for testing without the use of separate prototypes, chosen instead. Not surprisingly, a decision was made to limit production to the initial procurement until military acceptance testing and evaluation was well underway. The first F-101A was completed in August 1954 and shipped to Edwards Air Force Base, where its maiden flight was on September 24th with McDonnell test pilot Robert C. Little at the controls. Early testing indicated impressive performance, a top speed of Mach 1.54, an initial climb rate of 44,100 feet per minute, a service ceiling of 49,450 feet, and a maximum range of 2,186 miles. It also revealed aerodynamic flaws that were serious enough, in May 1956, for the Air Force to halt production pending resolution of its concerns. The most serious problem was a treacherous pitch-up tendency, encountered both in high and low airspeed ranges at certain G levels with angles of attack, frequently followed by engine compressor stalls that led to loss of power or total flameout. If the pitch-up, an uncontrollable flat spin condition oscillating between 20 and 70 degrees nose-up, occurred below 15,000 feet, Voodoo pilots were under standing orders to eject. The pitch-up problem was substantially remedied by installing a pitch inhibitor, would not allow the stick to be pulled past specific points at specific speeds, and the intakes and engine ducting were redesigned to diminish the possibility of compressor stalling. After what amounted to approximately 2,000 engineering changes, the hold order on F-101A production was finally lifted in November 1956, and the type was accepted for operational service in early May of 1957. Development and testing of the photo reconnaissance version, the RF-101A, followed the fighter version by about 18 months. But, due to the setbacks in the fighter program, the photo recon versions entered the operational service at virtually the same time. The aircraft was fitted with an MA-7 fire control radar for both air-to-air and air-to-ground use, augmented by a low-altitude bombing system for delivering nuclear weapons, and was designed to carry a Mark 28 nuclear bomb. The original intended payload for the F-101A was the McDonnell Model 96 Store, a large fuel/weapons pod similar in concept to that of the Convair B-58 Hustler, but was cancelled in March 1956 before the F-101 entered service. Other operational nuclear payloads included the Mark 7, Mark 43, and Mark 57 weapons. While theoretically capable of carrying conventional bombs, rockets, or Falcon air-to-air missiles, the Voodoo never used such weapons operationally. The RF-101A made its first flight in June 1956, and differed from the fighter mainly in carrying 150 gallons of additional internal fuel, and having a Lathan nose that housed 3 vertical and 2 oblique Fairchild cameras in place of the search radar and 20mm guns. The RFs shared the capability to deliver a single nuclear weapon carried on a centerline rack and were marginally faster than the Fs due to the reduced weight. F-101As became operational in May 1957, with the 27th Strategic Fighter Wing in their original bomber escort role, replacing their F-84F Thunderstreak. However, by this time, SAC had decided to abandon the long-range fighter concept. Even with its above-average range, the Voodoo could not escort the bombers. B-36s, and by that time B-47s and B-52s, all the way to their intended targets. The F-101A's career might have ended then and there, but for the intervention of Tactical Air Command, which saw potential in the big fighter as a tactical nuclear weapons delivery system platform. Thus, in mid-1957, the 27th Strategic Fighter Wing became the TAC-controlled 27th Fighter Bomber Wing, and all F-101As were thereafter retrofitted with the low-altitude bombing system and other apparatus needed to complete their new function as nuclear strike fighters. By late November 1957, the last of the 77 F-101As had been delivered to the Air Force. 50 of them assigned to operational units, with the remaining 27 held for experimental and test purposes. F-101As served in a frontline role until 1966, after which they were phased out and turned over to the Air National Guard units. The first of 35 production RF-101As was delivered to the 363rd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, TRW, at Shaw Air Force Base in May 1957. It was the first supersonic reconnaissance aircraft in the Air Force inventory, and, on November 27, 1957, as a part of Operation Sunrun, 4 RF-101As set a new transcontinental speed record. They flew round-trip between McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey and March Air Force Base in California in 6 hours, 46 minutes, and 36 seconds, with an average speed of 721 miles an hour. In the mid to late 1960s, our F-101As were used as reconnaissance trainers and were all phased out of the active Air Force inventory by 1971. A few serviceable examples following the conversion to our F-101G standards were transferred to Air National Guard units. Pilots who flew the Voodoo were impressed by its performance, dubbing it the One-O-Wonder, but they also considered it very unforgiving. Colonel C. Robert Oz Osborne Jr. said, "The F-101 was a lady, a fantastic airplane, but touchy, very touchy. It had to be flown properly." Air Force test pilot Richard Baird echoed that sentiment. "It's the biggest by-the-book fighter I've ever flown. The Voodoo would bite you. You really had to fly it strictly by the book." And reconnaissance pilot Colonel Jonathan Gardner noted that, "The first ride, you didn't fly it, you hung on to it." The improved F-101C and RF-101C were both ordered in March 1956. The Cs were externally identical to the A models, but had strengthened airframes to accept a higher load limit, and, in the case of the fighter version, were equipped from the start as tactical fighter bombers. All of the 47 F-101Cs built were delivered to the Air Force in 1957 to 1958, serving with the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing as nuclear strike aircraft until they were phased out in 1965 to 1966. The F-101C was the fastest tactical fighter in operational service until the advent of the Lockheed F-104, and on December 12, 1957, a stripped-down example set a new world record of 1,204 miles an hour, or Mach 1.83. The RF-101C, built in greater numbers than its fighter counterpart, entered operational service in September 1957, and the last of 166 was delivered in March 1959. RF-101Cs saw wide service with the US-based 363rd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, the Europe-based 66th TRW, and the Far East-based 67th TRW. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, RF-101As and Cs of the 363rd TRW flew low-level reconnaissance missions over Cuba. The RF-101C was the only Voodoo variant to see combat in Vietnam. In fact, as early as 1961, RF-101Cs of the 67th TRW, operating out of Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, began making surveillance flights over Laos and South Vietnam. During the same time period, 45th TRS Voodoos moved to Tan So Nhut Air Force Base in Vietnam to cover operations in the south, and served as pathfinders for the first bombing mission against the North on February 8, 1965. Between 1965 and 1970, 33 RF-101Cs were lost to enemy anti-aircraft and missiles, and one to a North Vietnamese MiG-21. Starting in late 1967, as more RF-4Cs arrived to the takeover reconnaissance duties, Voodoos were restricted from operations over North Vietnam. They were all ultimately withdrawn from the combat zone by late 1970. Upon their return to the States, RF-101Cs were retired from active U.S. Air Force service, and many were turned over to the Air National Guard's units. In 1965, 29 F-101As and 31 F-101Cs were modified under the new designations RF-101G and RF-101H, respectively, to serve as unarmed reconnaissance aircraft with the Air National Guard units. The modification entailed removal of radar and armament and the installation of a nose cone housing cameras and new electronic components. RF-101Gs and Hs were operated by 3 Air National Guard units, the 154th TRS in Arkansas, the 165th TRS in Kentucky, and the 192nd TRS in Nevada. In early 1968, the seizure of the U.S. naval surveillance vessel Pueblo by the North Koreans led to President Lyndon B. Johnson to activate all 3 Air National Guard Voodoo units. Each served a rotational tour at Itazuki Air Force Base, Japan, and compiled impressive records, flying 19,715 tactical hours and 11,561 sorties, and exposing 841,601 feet of aerial film. The last single-seat reconnaissance Voodoos were removed from the National Guard service in 1976. The most numerically important and longest-lived Voodoo was the two-seat all-weather fighter interceptor version, the F-101B. By the end of 1953, the Air Force's ambitious two-step interceptor program with Convair, the Mach 1 F-102A, scheduled to be followed by the Mach 2 F-102B, redesignated the F-106A in 1956, was seriously behind schedule. An aircraft was needed to plug the gap between this so-called ultimate interceptor and the subsonic Northrop F-89 Scorpions, Lockheed F-94 Starfires, and North American F-86D Sabres serving with Air Defense Command. ADC's Expression mission was strategic defense to interrupt and destroy Soviet bombers en route to the United States before they reached our shores. Late in 1953, the Air Force asked aircraft manufacturers to submit proposals for a new missile-armed all-weather interceptor under the classification Weapon Systems WS-217A. McDonnell offered a single or two-seat adaptation of the F-101 that would incorporate new fire control and missile systems and use more powerful Wright J67 engines, license-built copies of the British Bristol Olympus that were supposed to produce 22,000 pounds of static thrust each. The Air Force selected McDonnell's proposal in mid-1954, specifying the two-seat version, and issued a letter of intent in March 1955 for an additional batch of 28 aircraft and potential production of 68 more. The expectation was that the first flight would take place in mid-1956, and the prototype would enter the operational service in early 1958. After the letter of intent was issued, McDonnell requested the designation F-109 for the airframe portion of the WS-217A project, but the Air Force, evidently conscious of the funding obstacles associated with the new aircraft as opposed to the improvements to the existing type, called it the F-101B. Although McDonnell had the F-101B mock-up ready for inspection by September 1955, the entire Voodoo program was put on indefinite hold while the aforementioned aerodynamic problems with the F-101A were being ironed out. Further delays and uncertainties with the J67 engines led to a decision to use Pratt & Whitney J57P55 power plants, which featured longer afterburners and a thrust rating of 16,900 pounds per engine. The F-101B shared the center and aft fuselage sections and tail group of the F-101A series, and, other than bulged wheel well doors to house larger tires, the same wing platform. But the F-101B introduced a completely new, 4-foot longer forward fuselage section with a tandem cockpit layout for the pilot and radar operator. Also new was a Hughes MG tracking and fire control system, essentially an upgrade of the E6 system already utilized in the F-89D, and a rotary weapons bay that held 4 Hughes Falcon semi-active radar and infrared missiles. The first F-101B took off from Lambert Field in St. Louis on March 27, 1957, a year behind schedule, and the Air Force spent nearly 2 more years conducting extensive tests and evaluations before releasing the Voodoo interceptors to operational service. Flight performance met expectations, a top speed of Mach 1.66, a combat ceiling of 51,000 feet, and a normal range of 1,387 miles. But the F-101B had other problems that seriously hampered its operational effectiveness. The radar operator's position was poorly designed, and little could be done to improve it other than minor adjustments. Even more worrisome, the MG-13 fire control system did not adequately control the weapons on a platform as fast as the F-101. A proposal to replace the system with the more advanced MA-1 developed for the F-106 was rejected because of the cost involved. Deficiencies notwithstanding, the F-101Bs became operational with the 60th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts on January 5, 1959. On the plus side, the two-seater Voodoos had been extensively tested by the time they had reached ADC, and they finally gave the Air Force an interceptor capable of advanced performance at affordable cost, $1.7 million per plane, compared to $4.7 million for an F-106A. By the end of 1960, no fewer than 17 ADC squadrons were equipped with F-101Bs. Production ended in March 1961, with a total of 480 aircraft delivered. Beginning in 1959, McDonnell undertook a modification, in which approximately 1 out of every 4 F-101Bs would be fitted with dual controls while retaining full EVC mission capability. Used for conversion and operational training under the initial designation TF-101B, these aircraft were redesignated F-101Fs in 1961, after 79 examples had been modified. Late production F-101Bs boasted upgraded fire control systems and the ability to carry 2 nuclear-tipped, unglided Genie MB-1s or Air-2A missiles in place of the 2 Falcons. In a modernization program, Project Bold Journey, completed between 1963 and 1966, most F-101Bs were fitted with infrared sensors to facilitate tracking of hostile aircraft regardless of radar jamming, and also received a much improved pitch control mechanism that functioned through an automatic flight control system. F-101Bs/Fs began to be phased out of Air Force service in 1969, without having fired a shot in anger, and the last active duty squadrons operating the type, the 60th and 62nd FIS, retired their Voodoos in April 1971. Simultaneously, F-101Bs and Fs were delivered to the Air National Guard units, starting with the 116th FIS, Washington ANG in November 1969, and ultimately went on to fully equip 8 fighter interceptor units in 7 different states. The Air Force retained a small number of F-101Bs after 1971 for fighter interceptor training, and the last of those was retired in September 1982.
This fighter squadron is flying faster than the speed of sound. These pilots engaged in combat miles above the Earth. It was a truly fantastic concept. But when the first F-100 Super Sabres were delivered to the U.S. Air Force in 1953, that fantasy became a reality. Until then, the only planes to have broken the sound barrier were experimental test aircraft. With the arrival of the F-100, the age of supersonic air combat had truly begun. Their arrival wasn't an uneventful one. New planes set 2 records, the last subsonic world speed record and the first supersonic world speed record. After 4 years of development, the F-100 ushered in a new era. Ahead lay a long, tumultuous career that would be marked by distinction and marred by crashes and controversy. Overcoming the sound barrier was a landmark achievement, and the F-100 marked the dividing line between the first and second generation of jet fighters. Because the Air Force was just reaching the 100s to give as new plane designations, the first assortment of supersonic aircraft were known as the Sentry Fighters. The Sentry Fighters were renowned and included the F-105. But it was from the cockpits of the F-100 Super Sabres that the Thunderbird pilots would eventually choose to perform their aerobatic magic. The plane had its problems,